If you've ever stood at the edge of something terrifying and irreversible, you'll understand what it meant to walk through those iron gates on the coldest night of winter. The Blackthorn estate didn't welcome visitors, it devoured them. And tonight, it was about to swallow a bride whole. Stay with me through this darkness, because what happens when two broken souls collide in a marriage neither of them wanted might be the only truth worth holding on to when everything else burns. The carriage wheels ground against frozen gravel like bones breaking underfoot. Evelyn Harper pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching her breath fog the glass as the estate materialized through skeletal trees. Blackthorn Manor rose from the earth like a monument to everything dead and unforgiving. All sharp angles and blackened stone, windows that reflected nothing back. Her father's voice still echoed in her skull from 3 days ago. "You'll do this for the family, Evelyn. The Duke needs a wife. We need his money. That's all that matters. All that matters." She repeated it silently, trying to make it feel true. The carriage lurched to a stop. No footmen rushed forward. No warm lights beckoned from the entrance. Just cold and silence, and the awareness that she'd crossed into a place where ordinary rules didn't apply anymore. The door opened. Wind cut through her wedding dress, white silk that had cost more than her family's debts but felt thin as paper against the bite of winter air. She stepped down onto stones that gleamed with ice, and the manor's front door swung open with a groan that sounded almost human. A man stood in the doorway. Not the Duke. Too old, too severe, with eyes that looked at her the way you'd look at furniture being delivered. "Mrs. Blackthorn," he said, and the name landed on her like a chain. "I am Graves, the head steward. You're expected." Expected, not welcomed, not greeted with any pretense of warmth. She climbed the steps, her train dragging behind her like something already dead, and crossed the threshold into an entrance hall that could have held her entire childhood home 3 times over. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow. Portraits of severe-looking ancestors staring down with expressions that ranged from contempt to barely concealed fury. The air itself felt hostile, thick with the weight of too many years and too many secrets buried in the walls. "The Duke will see you in the study," Graves said, already turning away. "Follow me." She wanted to ask where her room was, where she might wash the road from her skin, change into something that didn't announce her as a sacrifice wrapped in silk. But Graves moved through the corridors with the expectation of obedience, and Evelyn had been raised to understand when questions wouldn't be answered. They passed through hallways lined with closed doors, no servants visible, no sound except their footsteps echoing off stone. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum where something still walked, refusing to lie down and accept death. Graves stopped before a heavy oak door, knocked once, and opened it without waiting for response. "Your wife. Your Grace." Then he was gone, and Evelyn stood alone in the doorway of a room dominated by darkness and the man who owned it. Duke Lucian Blackthorn sat behind a desk carved from wood so dark it looked like solidified night. He didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge her presence beyond the slight tightening of his jaw that suggested her existence was an interruption he tolerated only because necessity demanded it. She'd seen him once before, at the signing of the marriage contract. 20 seconds, maybe 30. Long enough to register height, dark hair, a face that would have been handsome if it hadn't been carved from ice and contempt. Now standing in his domain, she understood that first glimpse had shown her nothing. This was a man who'd learned to make himself into a weapon. Every line of his body spoke of coiled violence barely restrained, broad shoulders beneath a black coat that fit like armor, hands that gripped the pen with enough force to snap it, and a face, God, that face, beautiful in the way winter was beautiful right before it killed you. "Close the door," he said without looking up. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't expect refusal. Deep, cold, edged with something that might have been exhaustion or might have been rage so old it had fossilized into his bones. Evelyn closed the door. The click of the latch sounded final. "Sit." She crossed to the chair positioned in front of his desk, arranged her skirts, and folded her hands in her lap. Waited. If he wanted to play lord and servant, she could wait all night. She'd learned patience the way other girls learned dancing, through necessity and the understanding that some battles couldn't be fought head-on. Lucian signed whatever document held his attention, set the pen down with precise care, and finally, raised his eyes to look at her. The impact of his gaze hit like a physical blow. Dark eyes, almost black in the firelight, that looked at her with such complete absence of warmth, it was almost impressive. This wasn't indifference. Indifference implied the capacity to care if circumstances changed. What she saw in his face was active rejection of the possibility that she mattered at all. "I want to be clear about the terms of this arrangement," he said, each word clipped, measured, designed to establish distance. "You're here because your family needed money and mine needed the appearance of normalcy. Nothing more." "I understand," Evelyn said quietly. "Do you?" Not a question. He leaned back in his chair, still watching her with that unnerving intensity. "You'll have your own rooms in the East Wing. We'll attend necessary social functions together. Beyond that, you're free to occupy yourself however you wish, so long as you don't interfere with the running of this house or make demands on my time." "And what demands might I make?" She kept her voice level, curious to see if he'd acknowledge the absurdity of this conversation. "Affection, companionship, the fantasy that this marriage means anything beyond a financial transaction and a legal document." He stood, and she had to tip her head back to maintain eye contact as he rounded the desk. "I'm not a cruel man, Mrs. Blackthorne. I won't mistreat you. But I won't pretend to be something I'm not, either. This arrangement works if we both accept what it is." He stopped directly in front of her chair, close enough that she could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the tight control he maintained over every muscle in his face. "And what is it?" Evelyn asked. "A contract. Nothing more." She stood slowly, bringing herself to her full height, which still left her a head shorter than him. Up close, she could smell leather and smoke and something darker underneath, like earth after rain or blood on steel. "Then we're in agreement," she said. "I expect nothing from you, Your Grace, and you'll receive exactly what you've asked for." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. It vanished too quickly to name. "Graves will show you to your rooms. Breakfast is at 8. Don't be late." Dismissed. Like a servant. Like furniture that had been adequately explained to and could now be put in its designated corner. Evelyn moved toward the door, her hand on the brass handle, when his voice stopped her. "One more thing." She turned. He'd returned to his desk, was already reaching for another document, his attention shifting away from her like she'd already ceased to exist. "My rooms are in the West Wing. The door will be locked. Don't test it." The words landed with the weight of a threat and a warning and something else she couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe. Or the echo of something that had been fear once, before it calcified into rage. "I wouldn't dream of it," Evelyn said, and stepped into the hallway where Graves waited like a ghost who'd learned to take solid form. Bolts. The East Wing rooms were beautiful in the way a funeral was beautiful, everything perfect and cold and designed for the comfort of the dead. Silk wallpaper in deep burgundy, a 4-poster bed that could sleep 5. Wardrobes already filled with clothes she hadn't chosen, in styles that suggested someone had guessed at her size and preferences without bothering to ask. A maid appeared long enough to help her out of the wedding dress and into a nightgown that felt like wearing ice. Then disappeared again, leaving Evelyn alone in rooms so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She stood at the window looking out over grounds that stretched into darkness. Somewhere in this house, Lucino's and Blackthorne sat in his locked rooms surrounded by whatever demons he'd collected. And somewhere in these walls, the truth of what had turned a man into a fortress waited to be discovered. This is my life now, she thought. This cold. This silence. This man who looks at me like I'm already a ghost. But Evelyn Harper had survived worse than silence. Had learned to find warmth in places others wouldn't think to look. And if the Duke thought locks and coldness would keep her at bay, he didn't understand the particular kind of stubbornness that came from having nothing left to lose. She turned from the window, climbed into the massive bed, and lay in darkness listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere distant, she heard a door slam, heard footsteps that might have been Lucian's, pacing, then silence again. Tomorrow, she'd begin learning the rhythms of this place, would start mapping the territory she'd been dropped into without preparation or guide. Tonight, she'd simply exist in this strange new skin, this role of unwanted wife in a house that felt like it was holding its breath. Sleep came eventually, thin and unsatisfying, and in her dreams, dark eyes watched her from shadows, keeping guard over wounds too deep to heal and too old to remember their origin. Breakfast at 8 meant arriving at 7:55 to a dining room that could seat 30, but held only two place settings at opposite ends of a table carved from oak so old it might have been there when the foundation stones were laid. Lucien was already seated, reading a newspaper with the focused attention of a man using it as a barrier against interaction. He didn't acknowledge her entrance, didn't lower the paper when she took her seat. A servant, young, nervous, eyes that didn't quite meet hers, poured coffee and placed a plate of food in front of her that she hadn't asked for. Eveline ate in silence, drank coffee that was excellent and bitter, watched her husband hide behind newsprint, and wondered how long he thought he could maintain this charade. 20 minutes passed. Lucien finished his meal, set down the newspaper with careful precision, and stood. "I have business in town. I'll return this evening." "Will you need me to accompany you?" Eveline asked, her tone pleasant. "No." He walked out. She heard his footsteps recede down the hallway, heard the front door open and close, heard the carriage pull away over gravel. The servant who'd poured her coffee reappeared to clear plates, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to be invisible. "What's your name?" Eveline asked. The girl froze, plate halfway to the tray. "Annie, ma'am." "How long have you worked here, Annie?" 3 years, ma'am. And in those 3 years, has the Duke always taken breakfast alone?" Annie's eyes flickered toward the door, calculating whether answering honestly would cost her the job. "Yes, ma'am. Until today." "I see." Eveline folded her napkin, placed it beside her empty cup. "Tell me about the house. What parts should I avoid?" "Avoid, ma'am? Surely there are rooms the Duke prefers kept private, areas where I'd be unwelcome." Annie's face went pale. "The West Wing, ma'am. No one goes to the West Wing except Graves, and only when summoned." "Why?" I couldn't say, ma'am," which meant she could say, but had been forbidden. Eveline recognized the shape of enforced silence when she encountered it. "Thank you, Annie. That will be all." The girl fled like she'd been granted pardon from execution. Eveline remained at the table, drinking cold coffee and considering the architecture of the prison she'd been installed in. A house divided into wings. A husband who locked his door and forbade approach. Servants who'd learned to speak around the truth without actually lying. It was a system designed for maximum isolation, and Lucien had clearly perfected it. She spent the morning exploring permitted territories. The library held thousands of volumes, most untouched for decades based on the dust. The music room contained a pianoforte that hadn't been tuned in years. The morning room, the drawing room, the parlor, all exquisitely furnished, all completely devoid of life. No family portraits beyond those stern ancestors in the entrance hall. No personal items left carelessly on tables. No evidence that anyone actually lived here beyond the Duke and his carefully managed distance. By noon, Eveline had mapped every accessible corridor and learned nothing except that Blackthorn Manor was a monument to absence. Whatever life had existed here before had been systematically erased, leaving only the shell. She returned to her rooms, changed into a walking dress, and decided to test the boundaries outdoors. If she couldn't understand the man, maybe she could understand the land that had shaped him. The ground stretched for acres, most of them wild. A formal garden closer to the house showed signs of recent maintenance, hedges trimmed, paths swept. But beyond that, nature had been allowed to reclaim its territory. Woods pressed close on 3 sides. A stone wall marked the property line to the south, topped with iron spikes that made its purpose clear. Keep out, or keep in. Eveline walked until the house was a dark shape behind her, and the only sounds were wind and bare branches and crows calling warnings to each other. She found the remains of a garden folly, half collapsed and choked with vines. Found a graveyard with headstones so old the names had been worn away by weather and time. And she found, at the far edge of the property where woods met wall, a cottage that looked abandoned but wasn't. Smoke rose from the chimney, curtains hung in windows. Someone lived there, separate from the main house. She was considering whether to knock when the door opened and an old woman stepped out, leaning on a cane carved from blackthorn wood. "You're the new wife," the woman said. Not a question. "I am. Eveline Blackthorn. I know who you are, girl. Question is, do you know what you've married into?" The woman's eyes were sharp despite the lines of age around them. She had the look of someone who'd lived long enough to stop caring about politeness or social convention. "I'm beginning to understand I don't," Eveline admitted. The woman studied her with an intensity that felt like being weighed on scales that measured more than physical presence. "You've got spine, at least. You'll need it. Come in. We'll have tea. The cottage interior was small but warm, fire crackling in a hearth, herbs hanging from ceiling beams to dry. The old woman moved with practiced efficiency, setting a kettle to boil and gesturing for Evelyn to sit at a scarred wooden table. I'm Margaret, she said without preamble. I served this house for 40 years before I retired. Knew Lucien when he was a boy. What happened to him? The question escaped before Evelyn could consider whether it was wise to ask. Margaret poured tea into chipped cups, her hands steady, despite their age. What happens to any child raised by wolves pretending to be nobility? He learned to survive. I don't understand. No, you wouldn't. You see the Duke as he is now, cold, distant, cruel in his way. But cruelty learned is different from cruelty born. Lucien was gentle once, believed in honor and love and all those pretty lies the aristocracy tells itself to justify its existence. Margaret sat across from her, wrapping gnarled fingers around her cup. His father was a bastard. Worse than a bastard. He was a sadist who enjoyed breaking things. His mother died when Lucien was 10. After that, there was no buffer between the boy and his father's education. What kind of education? The kind that teaches you love is weakness. Trust is foolishness. Showing emotion is inviting pain. Margaret's expression hardened. I found him once, locked in the cellar for 3 days because he'd cried at his mother's funeral. He was 10 years old, and his father decided grief was unbecoming of a blackthorn. Evelyn's hand tightened on her cup. And no one stopped it? Who would? The Duke was master of this house and all who served in it. You didn't cross him unless you wanted to join whatever poor soul had earned his displeasure. Margaret sipped her tea, her gaze distant with memory. Lucien survived by learning to become what his father demanded: hard, unfeeling, impenetrable. By the time the old Duke died, and good riddance to the monster, the damage was done. How long ago? 5 years. Lucien was 23. Already more his father's son than anyone wanted to admit. Evelyn absorbed this, trying to reconcile the image of a 10-year-old boy locked in darkness with the man who'd dismissed her like furniture last night. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Margaret's eyes sharpened on her face. Because you're the first wife he's taken, the first person allowed close in years. And because I'm old enough to recognize when someone might actually give a damn about saving what's left of that boy underneath all that armor. I'm not here to save anyone. This is a business arrangement. Is it? Margaret smiled, and it held more knowledge than comfort. Then you're a fool, girl, because business arrangements don't walk 3 miles in winter to ask old women about their employer's past. Business arrangements don't look at locked doors and wonder what's behind them. Evelyn opened her mouth to protest and closed it again, because Margaret was right, and they both knew it. He'll fight you, the old woman continued. Every step of the way, he'll push and test and try to drive you off because that's what he's been taught. Love is pain. Closeness is danger. The only safety is in distance. Then what do you suggest I do? Survive. Hold your ground. Don't let him convince you he's the monster he pretends to be. Margaret reached across the table, her hand cold and strong on Evelyn's wrist. And for God's sake, don't fall for him, not until you're sure he's capable of catching you. Evelyn returned to the manor as afternoon faded into dusk, her mind churning with Margaret's words. The house felt different now, less like a prison and more like a battlefield where old wars were still being fought in empty corridors. She changed for dinner, choosing a dress of deep green that made her feel less like a ghost and more like something with substance. Descended to the dining room at precisely the expected time and found Lucien already seated, the newspaper barrier once again erected between them. This time, she didn't wait for permission. I met Margaret today, Evelyn said, claiming her seat. The newspaper lowered slowly. Lucien's expression revealed nothing, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped the edges of the paper. I wasn't aware Margaret was receiving visitors. She invited me for tea. We had an interesting conversation. Did you? She told me about your father. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Lucien set down the newspaper with the careful control of a man resisting the urge to violence. Margaret, he said with precise coldness, is an old woman whose mind wanders. Whatever stories she told you are the ramblings of senility and should be disregarded. She seemed perfectly lucid to me. Then she's a liar trading in gossip to entertain herself. He stood, shoving back from the table hard enough to make Crystal shake. My past is not your concern, Mrs. Blackthorne. I'd suggest you remember that. And I'd suggest, Evelyn said calmly, meeting his fury without flinching, That if you don't want people asking questions, you shouldn't surround yourself with mysteries. For a moment, she thought he might actually lose control, saw his jaw clench, saw the muscle jump in his temple, saw his hands flex like he was considering wrapping them around her throat. Then, with visible effort, he pulled the mask back into place. Cold, distant, untouchable. Dinner will be served shortly. I expect we can manage civility for the duration of the meal. He sat. She stayed seated. The servant brought food neither of them had appetite for. They ate in silence that felt like combat, each movement calculated, each glance a parry or thrust in a duel conducted without weapons, but no less vicious for the lack. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn spoke again. "I'm not your enemy." Lucian didn't look up from his plate. "You're my wife. In my experience, there's little difference. Your mother is dead." The words came out like bullets. "And if you value the illusion of peace in this house, you will never mention her again." Why? Because acknowledging she existed means acknowledging you once had the capacity for love? The plate shattered. Lucien had thrown it, not at her, but at the wall behind her head, with enough force that porcelain exploded into fragments. Food slid down burgundy wallpaper. A shard cut her cheek, bright pain and warm blood. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just sat there watching him breathe hard, watching him realize what he'd done, watching him struggle to rebuild control over the rage that had slipped its leash. "Get out," he said, voice shaking. "No. Get out. Not until you explain why mention of your mother makes you violent enough to destroy things." He rounded the table so fast she barely had time to process movement before he was there, hands slamming down on the arms of her chair, caging her in with his body. This close, she could see the damage in his eyes. Not just anger, but anguish so deep it had carved channels into his soul. "You want to know why?" His breath came ragged. "Because she promised she'd never leave. Because she said love was real and forever and nothing could take it away. And then she died, and my father made sure I understood that every promise is a lie, and every declaration of love is just another weapon waiting to be used against you." "That's not love," Evelyn said quietly. "That's grief weaponized by a monster." "Don't." The word broke. "Don't try to make this into something it isn't. Don't try to fix me like I'm a puzzle you can solve. I am what I am. Accept it or leave." "I can't leave. We're married." "Then accept it." She raised her hand slowly, giving him time to pull away. He didn't. She touched the scar through his eyebrow, felt him flinch, watched his eyes close like the contact burned. "I accept that you're in pain," she said. "I accept that you've been taught to equate vulnerability with weakness. I accept that you hate me for seeing it, but I don't accept that this—" She gestured at the broken plate, the blood on her cheek, the trembling fury radiating from his body, "is all you're capable of." He pulled away like she'd struck him, stepped back, straightened his coat with shaking hands. "Clean your face," he said. "Graves will have a maid attend to it." Then he walked out, leaving her alone with shattered porcelain and the understanding that she'd just crossed a line he'd never meant to let anyone approach. The cut was shallow. The maid who tended it, not Annie, someone older with eyes that had seen worse, said nothing about how it had happened. Applied salve, wrapped a bandage, disappeared again into the house's careful silence. Evelyn returned to her rooms, changed into her nightgown, and stood at the window watching darkness swallow the grounds. Somewhere in the West Wing, Lucian was doing whatever he did when rage and pain overwhelmed the control he maintained so fiercely. She should be afraid of him, should be planning escape or at least strategic distance. Instead, all she felt was a strange, fierce determination to understand the architecture of his damage. Because Margaret was right. This wasn't a business arrangement. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. Maybe the moment she'd agreed to marry a man she didn't know. She'd signed up for something far more complicated than a contract. The house settled into the nighttime rhythms around her. She climbed into bed, pulled blankets up to her chin, and waited for sleep that didn't come. Midnight arrived. 1 in the morning, 2. Then she heard it, a sound from somewhere distant in the house. A shout. No, not a shout. A scream. Raw and agonized, and so completely stripped of pretense it didn't sound human. Evelyn was out of bed before conscious thought engaged. Grabbed a robe, padded barefoot into the hallway where that sound echoed off stone like something trapped and dying. The West Wing. It came from the West Wing. She ran. Through corridors lit only by moonlight through tall windows, past portraits that watched with their painted eyes. Toward the sound of suffering she couldn't ignore even knowing she'd been forbidden to approach. The screaming stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the void. She slowed, suddenly aware she was standing outside a door she'd been explicitly told never to test. It was locked. Of course it was locked. But through the heavy wood she could hear him, breathing like he'd run miles, moving restlessly. Then his voice, hoarse and broken. "No, no, please, I'll be better. I swear I'll be better." Begging. Duke Lucian Blackthorne, master of this house and fortress against the world, was begging something in the darkness of his mind. Evelyn pressed her hand against the door, wishing she could reach through wood and whatever hell he was trapped in. "Lucien," she said quietly. The movement inside stopped. She heard him approach the door, felt his presence on the other side like heat through metal. "Go away!" His voice was destroyed, stripped raw. "Not until you tell me you're all right." "I'm fine." "You're having nightmares violent enough to wake the entire house. That's not fine." Silence. Then barely audible. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to open the door." "Why?" "So you can see what a monster looks like when it takes off its mask?" He laughed, bitter and broken. "So you can collect the stories to trade over tea with Margaret?" "No. So you don't have to be alone with whatever's hunting you." More silence. She heard him press against the door on his side, mirroring her position. "You should go," he said. "You should run from this house and never look back." "Probably. But I've never been good at doing what I should." Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her name. The sound of it in his ruined voice cracked something in her chest. "I'm not leaving this hallway until you open the door or morning comes," she said. "Your choice." She heard him breathe, heard the war happening behind that locked door. Then the scrape of metal, the turn of a key. The door opened. Lucien stood in the doorway wearing only trousers, and in the dim light from his room, she saw what he'd been hiding. Scars. Not the faint lines of old injuries, but the brutal geography of systematic torture. They covered his chest, his back, his arms, pale against his skin, each one a record of pain inflicted by someone who'd understood exactly how to break a person without killing them. She didn't gasp, didn't flinch, just looked at him, at the damage and the defiance, and the terrible vulnerability of being seen like this. "Satisfied?" he asked, voice rough. "No," Evelyn said. "But at least now I understand why you locked the door." She stepped forward. He stepped back. They stood in his room, larger than hers, but just as cold, just as carefully devoid of personality, and regarded each other like combatants calling temporary truce. "How often do the nightmares come?" she asked. "Every night. And you deal with them alone." "It's how I've always dealt with them." She moved to the chair near his fireplace, sat down, and pulled her robe tighter against the cold. "Not anymore." "What are you doing?" "Staying. You said they come every night, so I'll stay every night until they don't." He stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. Maybe stepping into the darkness with a man who'd just shown her the evidence of his destruction was the definition of insanity. But Evelyn had learned young that sanity was overrated. Survival mattered more. And something in her gut said surviving this, surviving him, meant refusing to abandon him to the hell he'd been locked in alone for years. "You can't stay here," Lucien said. "Watch me." "Evelyn, argue if you want. Rage. Tell me to leave. But I'm not moving from this chair, so you might as well go back to bed and try to sleep, because neither of us is getting rest otherwise." For a moment she thought he'd physically drag her out. Saw him consider it, saw him reject it, saw something like defeat cross his face before he turned away, climbed back into his bed, and lay there staring at the ceiling. She stayed in the chair, kept watch while he fought demons in the dark. And when the nightmare came again, an hour later, when he thrashed and cried out and woke gasping like a drowning man breaching water, she was there, didn't touch him, didn't speak, just sat in the darkness being present while he remembered where he was, who he was. That the person who'd carved those scars into his flesh was dead and buried and couldn't hurt him anymore, except in dreams. He looked at her across the dim room, and something in his expression shifted. Not softening, exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement that she'd kept her word, that she hadn't fled or used his vulnerability as a weapon. Why? He asked. Because everyone deserves someone in the dark with them, Evelyn said. Even you. Dawn came eventually, gray light seeping through windows. The nightmares retreated with the darkness, leaving Lucien exhausted and Evelyn stiff from sitting in an uncomfortable chair for hours. He stood, moved to the window, looked out at grounds awakening to morning. This doesn't change anything, he said without turning. I know. We're still what we are. A contract, nothing more. If you say so. He turned then, and in the morning light she saw him properly. Not the fortress, or the monster, or the untouchable duke. Just a man so thoroughly broken he'd built himself into a weapon because weapons couldn't be hurt. You should go, he said, before the servants wake and find you here. Evelyn stood, bones protesting, crossed to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. Same time tonight? She asked. His jaw clenched. You're remarkably stubborn. I prefer persistent. See you at breakfast, Your Grace. She walked back to her own rooms as the house came alive around her, changed into a day dress, washed the night from her face, descended to the dining room at precisely 8 where Lucien already sat behind his newspaper fortress. But this time, when she took her seat, he lowered the paper, met her eyes. And something passed between them. Not warmth, not anything close to affection, but acknowledgement, respect maybe, or just the understanding that the rules of their arrangement had shifted in the dark and neither of them could pretend otherwise. Good morning, he said. 2 words, simple, ordinary, and somehow more intimate than anything that had come before. Good morning, Evelyn replied and smiled despite everything because somewhere in the night she'd managed to crack the fortress and glimpse the prisoner inside. Now came the hard part, learning to reach him, learning to convince him freedom was possible, learning to survive the damage he'd inflict along the way as he fought against every instinct screaming that vulnerability meant death. But Evelyn Harper had never run from hard things, and she wasn't about to start now. The pattern established itself over the next 3 weeks, like scar tissue forming over a wound, painful, necessary, and permanent. Every night, Evelyn crossed the invisible boundary between east and west wings. Every night she found Lucien's door unlocked but not open, which meant he'd made the choice to allow her entry without making it easy. She'd settle into the same uncomfortable chair. He'd lie in bed pretending her presence didn't matter. And when the nightmares came, because they always came, she'd sit in the darkness while he fought demons that had his father's voice and his mother's absence. They didn't speak about it during daylight hours. Breakfast remained a silent battle conducted over coffee and newspapers. Dinners were exercises in civility that felt like truce agreements between hostile nations. But the nights created a separate reality where pretense dissolved and something rawer took its place. The servants noticed, of course. Impossible not to when the new Duchess emerged from the forbidden wing, every dawn looking hollowed out by lack of sleep. But Graves maintained his careful silence, and the staff followed his lead because questioning the Duke's business was a guaranteed path to unemployment. Margaret noticed too. Evelyn returned to the cottage every few days, ostensibly for tea, but really for the old woman's particular brand of brutal honesty. It was during one of these visits, 3 weeks into her peculiar marriage, that Margaret looked at her over the rim of a chipped cup and said, "You're falling for him." Evelyn nearly choked on her tea. "I'm doing no such thing." Don't lie to an old woman who's forgotten more about human nature than you've learned yet. You've got that look, like you've found something broken and decided fixing it is your personal mission. I'm not trying to fix him. No? Margaret's eyebrow arched. Then what do you call spending every night in his room watching him bleed from wounds you can't see? Keeping my word. I said I'd stay. I'm staying. And what happens when staying isn't enough anymore? When you want more than just being witness to his pain? Evelyn set down her cup with more force than necessary. Then I'll deal with it. But right now he needs someone who doesn't run when things get dark. That's all this is. Margaret studied her with eyes that had watched too many tragedies unfold to believe in happy endings. You're lying to yourself, girl, and that's more dangerous than lying to me. The conversation haunted Evelyn on the walk back to the manor, because Margaret was right, damn her. Somewhere between the first nightmare and the 20th, between the careful distance at breakfast and the raw vulnerability at midnight, something had shifted. She'd started watching Lucien when he wasn't looking, started noticing details, the way exhaustion carved shadows under his eyes, the precise control he maintained over every gesture. The moments when his mask slipped and she glimpsed the person underneath. It wasn't love. She refused to call it love. Love required reciprocation, required softness, required the possibility of something beyond this strange dance they were doing in the dark. But it was something, and that something terrified her more than his rage ever had. The first crack in Lucian's armor came on a Thursday. Eveline had spent the afternoon in the library, reading through old ledgers because understanding the estate's finances felt like understanding the bones of the prison she'd been installed in. Dinner passed in the usual silence. She excused herself early, exhausted from poor sleep, and retreated to her rooms with plans to collapse into bed before midnight watch began. She was halfway through changing when she heard the commotion downstairs. Raised voices, the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. Then Lucien's voice, cold and vicious in a way that made her stomach clench. Eveline grabbed a robe and ran. She found him in the entrance hall, standing over a young footman who'd apparently dropped a silver serving tray. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, and he was backed against the wall with Lucien looming over him like death itself. "Clumsy idiot," Lucien was saying, each word precise and cutting. "Do you have any idea what that tray is worth? More than your entire family will earn in a year." "I'm sorry, Your Grace, Sorry isn't sufficient. Sorry doesn't replace what you've destroyed." The boy was shaking. Eveline saw it from across the hall, the trembling that came from genuine terror, the wide eyes of someone confronting power that could crush them without consequence. And she saw something else. Saw the way Lucien's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Saw the muscle jumping in his jaw. Saw the carefully controlled fury of a man who'd learned to weaponize his father's lessons because anger was safer than anything that resembled vulnerability. "Lucien," she said quietly. He didn't turn. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when you're terrorizing a child over an accident. He damaged valuable property. It's a tray. It can be replaced." She moved closer, positioning herself between Lucien and the footman. "He can't." Lucien's eyes locked on hers, and for a moment she saw murder there, not directed at her exactly, directed at the interruption, the challenge, the audacity of someone stepping between him and the outlet for whatever rage was eating him alive. "You're defending incompetence. I'm defending compassion, something you might try remembering exists." His hand shot out, grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. She felt the violence in him, barely leashed, looking for target and release. "Don't," he said through clenched teeth, "presume to lecture me about compassion in my own house." Behind her, the footman had gone perfectly still, probably praying he'd become invisible. Eveline held Lucien's stare, refusing to flinch even though his grip was cutting off circulation. "Then don't give me reason to. Let him go. The tray is damaged, not destroyed. Take the cost from his wages if you must, but don't humiliate him for being human. Why do you care? He's nothing to you. He's someone's son. Someone's whole world, probably, and you're treating him like your father treated you." The words landed like a slap. Lucien's grip tightened for a heartbeat, then released so abruptly she stumbled. He stepped back, his face a mask of controlled rage and something darker. Recognition, maybe, or horror at the mirror she'd just held up. "Get out of my sight," he said to the footman without looking at him. "Both of you." The boy fled. Eveline stayed. "You don't get to do that," she said quietly. "You don't get to become him. You know nothing about what I get to do. I know you're better than this. I've seen it. In the dark, when you think no one's watching, I've seen the person you're trying so hard to bury." Lucien moved fast, backing her against the wall with his body, one hand braced beside her head. Up close, she could see the war happening behind his eyes, rage and shame and desperate need to make someone hurt the way he was hurting. "You want to see who I really am?" His voice dropped to something dangerous. "I'm the son of a monster, trained by a monster, inheriting his empire and his methods. You can dress it up with your compassion and your optimism, but underneath, I'm exactly what he made me." "You're lying." "Am I? What do you call what just happened? What do you call the way I wanted to break that boy for having the audacity to make a mistake in front of me? I call it learned behavior, trauma response, the scar tissue from years of abuse." She raised her hand, pressed it flat against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. "I don't call it who you are. You're a fool. Maybe. But I'm a fool who spent 3 weeks watching you fight yourself every single night. I know which version wins in the dark, and it's not your father's." For a moment, she thought he'd kiss her. saw it in the way his eyes dropped to her mouth, in the slight hitch of his breath, in the infinitesimal lean forward before he caught himself and pulled back like she'd burned him. "This is why I told you not to interfere," he said roughly. "This is why I wanted distance. Because you might actually start to care if I stay close enough?" His jaw clenched. "Because I'll destroy you. It's what I do. It's all I know how to do." "Then teach yourself something different." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You choose. Every moment, you choose. Terror or compassion. Your father or yourself. Destruction or something better." She pushed away from the wall, from his heat and his rage and the terrible pull of wanting to fix what his father had broken. "I'm going to bed. You can join me in an hour for the usual nightmare watch, or you can stay down here and practice being the monster you're convinced you've become. Your choice." She walked away. Didn't look back. Climbed the stairs, feeling his stare like a brand between her shoulder blades. An hour later, she was in his room, settled in the chair that had become hers through repetition. He arrived 10 minutes after that, still dressed for the day, eyes dark with exhaustion and something else she couldn't name. He didn't speak, just stripped off his coat, his waistcoat, his shirt, revealing the topography of scars she'd learned by heart over 3 weeks of watching. Climbed into bed, stared at the ceiling. "I'm sorry," he said into the darkness. It was the first apology she'd heard from him, ever. "For which part?" "All of it. The footman, grabbing you, being exactly what you accused me of being." Evelyn pulled her robe tighter. "You're not him. You stopped yourself. He never would have stopped." "I stopped because you were there. What happens when you're not?" "Then you stop yourself because you've learned you can." He turned his head, looking at her across the dim room. "Why are you doing this? Really?" It was the question she'd been avoiding since Margaret called her out. The question she didn't have a safe answer for. "Because everyone deserves someone who doesn't give up on them," she said finally. "Even you, especially you." "That's not an answer. That's a deflection." "Fine. You want honesty?" She leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Because I see myself in you. Different damage, different scars, but the same fundamental belief that we're not worth saving. And I'm tired of believing that. For both of us." Lucian sat up slowly, the blankets pooling at his waist. "What damage? Your family sent you here for money, but that's not trauma, that's transaction. My family sent me here because I was convenient. The disappointing daughter who never quite measured up. Too opinionated, too stubborn, too resistant to being shaped into whatever decorative object they needed. Marrying me off solved 2 problems, their debt and my existence." She hadn't meant to say that much, hadn't meant to crack herself open when the focus was supposed to stay on him. But something about the darkness and his rare vulnerability pulled truth from her like blood from a wound. "So we're both here because we were unwanted," Lucian said quietly, "and we're both pretending it doesn't matter." "Does it matter?" "I don't know. Maybe what matters is what we do with it." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the sense of being weighed, measured, evaluated for some purpose she couldn't identify. "Come here," he said. "What?" "You've spent 3 weeks in that chair. It can't be comfortable. Come here." Evelyn's heart stuttered. "Lucienne, I'm not propositioning you. I'm offering you half a bed that's large enough to sleep 4. If you're going to insist on staying for the nightmares, at least don't destroy your spine in the process." She should refuse, should maintain the careful distance that had kept this arrangement from becoming something more complicated. But her back ached from too many nights in that chair, and exhaustion had worn down her resistance to dangerous ideas. She crossed to the bed, climbed in on the far side, maintaining a careful foot of space between them, settled against pillows that smelled like him, smoke and leather and something darker. They lay in silence, both staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of the other's breathing. "This doesn't change anything," Lucian said eventually. "I know. We're still a contract, nothing more. You've mentioned it." Another silence, then his voice, barely audible. "Thank you for stopping me earlier, for not letting me become him. Thank you for listening." His hand found hers in the darkness between them. Didn't grip, didn't hold, just rested there, palm to palm, fingers barely touching. The most tentative contact, like he was testing whether connection would burn. It didn't burn. It settled, strange and warm and terrifying in its simplicity. When the nightmare came 2 hours later, Evelyn woke to Lucian thrashing beside her, caught in whatever hell his mind conjured. She turned on her side, placed a hand on his shoulder the first time she'd touched him during an episode, and spoke his name quietly. He woke gasping, eyes wild, and for a second didn't recognize where he was. Then awareness crashed back. He looked at her hand on his scarred skin, at the concern in her face.
"You're safe," she said. "You're here. He's dead. You're safe." Lucian's breathing slowed. He didn't pull away from her touch, just stared at her like she was something he'd never seen before. "How do you do that?" he asked roughly. "Do what?" "Make me believe it might be true."
The shift was subtle but undeniable. Breakfast conversation started including actual words beyond pleasantries. Lucien began lowering the newspaper barrier voluntarily. They'd discuss estate business, the weather, nothing of consequence but everything in the space between words. Dinners evolved from silent endurance to something approaching companionable. He asked about her day. She asked about his. They danced around real intimacy while constructing its framework through repetition and proximity. The staff noticed. Graves's eyebrow lifted fractionally one morning when he found them laughing over something trivial. Annie smiled more. The whole house seemed to exhale, tensions easing as the Duke's legendary coldness thawed by increments. But the aristocracy noticed too. The first dinner invitation arrived 4 weeks into their marriage. Lord and Lady Ashford hosting a small gathering for intimate friends. Translation: close enough to the family to demand appearance, far enough to gossip viciously about whatever scandal they witnessed. Lucien read the invitation at breakfast, his expression darkening. "We'll decline," he said. "Why?" "Because these people are vultures. They'll spend the entire evening looking for weakness to exploit. Then we don't give them any." He looked at her over the edge of the invitation. "You want to attend?" "I want to see what we look like outside these walls, and I want you to stop hiding." "I'm not hiding. You've barely left this estate since I arrived. You're letting them win by default." His jaw tightened. "They don't win or lose. They're irrelevant." "Are they?" "Because from where I'm sitting, you've given them exactly what they want. The reclusive Duke, too damaged to function in society, proving every whispered rumor true." It was a calculated provocation. She saw it land, saw him bristle, saw the pride that had kept him functional through hell rise to meet the challenge. "Fine," he said coldly. "We'll attend. But when it's a disaster, don't say I didn't warn you." The Ashford estate blazed with light and laughter. Everything Blackthorn Manor wasn't. Eveline descended from the carriage on Lucien's arm, feeling his tension through the expensive fabric of his coat. They dressed for battle. Him in black superfine that made him look like elegant death. Her in midnight blue silk that Margaret had helped select for maximum impact. They looked like what they were, a duke and duchess united by contract but presenting the image of partnership. The moment they entered, conversation dimmed. Eveline felt the weight of every eye, every whisper barely concealed behind fans and wine glasses. The Mad Duke and his purchased bride. Entertainment for the evening. Lord Ashford approached with the smile of a predator scenting blood. "Your Grace, how wonderful you could join us. And the new Duchess, we've heard so much about you." "All of it terrible, I'm sure," Eveline said pleasantly. Ashford laughed, surprised by her directness. "Not at all. We're simply curious about the woman brave enough to marry into the Blackthorn legacy." "Brave or desperate," a woman's voice cut in. Lady Ashford herself, dripping jewels and malice. One never can tell with these arrangements. Lucian's arm turned to steel under Eveline's hand. She squeezed gently, a reminder to keep the monster leashed. "Desperate implies I had better options," Eveline said. "I didn't, but brave suggests I knew what I was getting into and chose it anyway. Which do you think is worse?" The slight ripple of laughter from nearby guests told her the barb had landed. Lady Ashford's smile sharpened. "How refreshing. A duchess with a tongue. Your Grace, you must be so pleased." "Thrilled beyond measure," Lucien said flatly. They circulated through the gathering like soldiers moving through hostile territory. Eveline felt the constant assessment, the searching for cracks in their facade. She played her role perfectly, the devoted wife, the charming addition to an intimidating bloodline, the woman who'd somehow convinced London's most notorious recluse to rejoin society. But Lucien was struggling. She saw it in the tight line of his shoulders, the clipped responses, the way his free hand kept clenching and releasing. This many people, this much scrutiny, this performance of normalcy. It was scraping him raw. They made it through dinner, survived the meaningless conversation and veiled insults dressed as curiosity. Then, during dessert, a young lord, drunk enough to be stupid, decided to push his luck. Tell me, Your Grace, is it true your father kept you locked in the cellar as a boy? I've heard the most fascinating stories about the old Duke's educational methods. The table went silent. Evelyn felt Lucien go absolutely still beside her, felt the violence gathering in him like a storm. Careful, Lucien said, his voice dropping to something lethal. You're about to make a mistake you can't take back.
Oh, come now. We're all friends here. Surely you can laugh about it now that the old monster's dead. Laugh. Lucien set down his wine glass with precise control. You want me to laugh about systematic torture disguised as education, about a childhood spent learning that pain was the only reliable constant, about scars that run so deep they've become the architecture of who I am. He stood. Every eye followed him. You're right about one thing. My father was a monster, and he made sure his legacy survived him because monsters don't die. They just teach their methods to the next generation. Evelyn stood too, placing herself between Lucien and the idiot lord who'd triggered this. We're leaving.
No. Lucien's eyes were black with rage. Let him finish. Let him ask all his fascinating questions about the Duke who screams himself awake every night. About the man so damaged he can barely tolerate human contact. Let's make it entertainment for everyone. Lucien. He rounded on her, and she saw the moment he realized what he'd just exposed. Saw horror chase the anger across his face. Saw him understand he'd handed these vultures exactly the ammunition they'd been searching for. Excuse me, he said roughly, and walked out of the dining room. The silence he left behind was deafening. Evelyn looked around the table, at the shocked faces and barely concealed glee, and made a decision. My husband, she said clearly, survived hell you couldn't imagine and came out stronger for it. What he just described isn't weakness. It's evidence of the kind of strength required to keep functioning when everything inside you is screaming to break. She fixed the young lord with a stare that could have stripped paint. And you, sir, are exactly the kind of small-minded coward who mistakes cruelty for entertainment. I hope you're proud of yourself. Then she followed Lucien out, leaving chaos and scandal in her wake. She found him in the garden, gripping a stone balustrade hard enough to crack it, breathing like he'd run miles. Don't, he said when he heard her approach. Don't try to fix this. I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm making sure you don't destroy yourself over one idiot's stupidity. You heard what I said in there. You heard what I exposed. I heard you tell the truth. There's no shame in that. He laughed, bitter and broken. No shame. I just confirmed every rumor, every whispered story, every piece of gossip they've been trading about the Mad Duke. I handed them ammunition they'll use for years. So what? Let them talk. Let them whisper. You are exactly what you said, someone who survived hell and kept going. That's not shameful. That's remarkable. Lucien turned to face her, and his expression was devastated. You don't understand. This is why I stayed hidden. This is why I kept distance. Because the moment anyone gets close enough to see the damage, they run, or they weaponize it. And I can't survive you doing either. The admission hung between them like something bleeding. Evelyn's heart cracked at the raw vulnerability in his voice, at the fear beneath the rage. I'm not running, she said quietly. And I'm not them. You should know that by now. Should I? You've been here a month. 1 month against 28 years of evidence that everyone leaves or destroys. Why would you be different? Because I'm choosing to be. Every day I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing to sit in that chair, sleep in that bed, stand between you and the people who want to watch you bleed. That's not obligation. That's choice. Why? The word ripped out of him. Why choose this? Why choose me? And there it was. The question she'd been avoiding, the truth she'd been running from, the admission that terrified her more than anything else. Because somewhere between the first nightmare and now, you stopped being a contract, Evelyn said. You became someone I can't walk away from, someone I don't want to walk away from. Lucien stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't understand. That's a mistake. Probably. But it's my mistake to make. I'll hurt you. I'll destroy this the way I destroy everything. Then destroy it. But I'm not leaving until you do. He moved then, closing the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face. You're a fool. You've mentioned that. I mean it. You should run from me as fast as you can. Make me. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen. Then Lucien kissed her, not gently, not softly, but with all the desperation of a drowning man grasping for air.
His mouth was fierce on hers, tasting of wine and rage, and something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been beaten out of him years ago. Evelyn kissed back, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact, that she saw him, all of him, scars and damage, and the person underneath. That she wasn't afraid, that she'd meant every word about choosing to stay. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucien pressed his forehead to hers. "This changes everything," he said roughly. "I know. I don't know how to do this, how to be what you need." "Then we'll figure it out together. They'll use this against us. Against you. Let them try." He pulled back enough to look at her, and something in his expression had shifted. Still guarded, still scarred, but with the first crack in the fortress that suggested light might reach the prisoner inside. "We should go home," he said. Yes, they returned to find the household pretending not to notice the Duke's disheveled appearance, or the Duchess's kiss-bruised lips. Graves maintained his perfect discretion. The staff became suddenly very busy with tasks that required them to be elsewhere. Evelyn and Lucien climbed the stairs together, her hand in his, and when they reached the hallway that split toward their separate wings, he turned toward hers instead of his own. No words. Just the implicit question and her answer in the way she led him to her rooms, to her bed, to the intimacy they'd been circling for weeks. Afterwards, lying in darkness with his scarred chest beneath her palm and his heartbeat steady under her ear, Evelyn felt the weight of what they'd just crossed. This wasn't a contract anymore. Wasn't distance or safety or the careful boundaries they'd constructed. This was free fall. This was choosing each other despite every reason not to. This was dangerous and terrifying and exactly what Margaret had warned her against. Lucien's hand settled in her hair, holding her close like she might evaporate if he let go. "I don't know how to do this without destroying it," he said quietly into the darkness. "Then we'll learn together. And when I inevitably fail, then we'll fail together too." His arms tightened. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe. But not tonight." They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time in weeks the nightmares didn't come. Or if they did, they were held at bay by the warmth of another person who'd chosen to stay despite the darkness. Morning brought reality crashing back. News of the dinner disaster had spread faster than wildfire. By noon, 3 separate gossip sheets had published variations of the scandal: the Mad Duke's confession, the Duchess's fierce defense, speculation about the state of their marriage, and whether it would survive the scrutiny. Lucien read them in his study, his expression darkening with each paragraph. "They're calling you my keeper," he said when Evelyn joined him, "speculating that the family married you off to manage my instability." "Let them speculate. This affects you too. Your reputation, my reputation was purchased and paid for the moment I agreed to this marriage. I'm not concerned about what people think." He looked at her, really looked, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to believe her fighting the part that had been taught belief was weakness. "My enemies will use this," he said finally. "The people who've been waiting for me to fail will see weakness. They'll move against us. Then we move first." "How?" Evelyn settled into the chair across from his desk. "Tell me about these enemies. Who wants to see you fall?" And Lucien, who'd spent years keeping his own counsel and trusting no one, started talking. About the conspiracy theories he'd never quite proven. About the business rivals who'd benefited from his father's death. About the members of court who whispered that the Blackthorn line was cursed and should be allowed to die out. It was trust, raw and unprecedented. And as he spoke, as he shared secrets he'd carried alone for years, Evelyn understood they'd passed the point of no return. Whatever came next would destroy them or forge them into something unbreakable, and there was no going back. The conspiracy unraveled slowly, like pulling thread from a tapestry, only to discover the entire fabric had been rotting from within. Lucien spent the week following the Ashford disaster locked in his study, going through ledgers and correspondence with the intensity of a man searching for bombs he knew were planted but couldn't locate. Evelyn brought him meals he barely touched, sat with him through sessions that stretched past midnight, learned the financial architecture of an empire built on old money and older grudges. The pattern emerged gradually. Contracts that should have been profitable but somehow weren't. Business partners who'd backed out at the last moment, citing concerns about the Duke's stability. Investments that had failed due to information leaks that shouldn't have been possible. Someone had been sabotaging the Blackthorn holdings for years. Someone close enough to access sensitive information. Someone trusted.
It was Graves who finally gave them the lead, arriving in the study on the 8th day with an expression that managed to look apologetic and grim simultaneously. Your Grace, I discovered this among the household accounts. He placed a leather-bound book on the desk. It doesn't match our official records. Lucien opened it. His face went carefully blank as he scanned the entries, payments made to names Evelyn didn't recognize, amounts that didn't correspond to any legitimate household expense, dates that stretched back 5 years. Someone's been embezzling, Lucien said quietly, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. It appears so, Your Grace. The signatures are forged, but the accounts are real. Whoever did this had access to the estate's financial systems and knowledge of how to hide the theft. Evelyn leaned over Lucien's shoulder, studying the entries. The amounts were substantial, but not massive, carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection while bleeding the estate dry over time. Who has that kind of access? She asked. Graves hesitated. Very few people, Your Grace. Myself, the Duke, and Lord Harrington. The name landed like a stone in still water. Lord Harrington, Lucien's uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who'd served as regent during Lucien's minority after the old Duke's death, the man who taught Lucien the business of running an estate while supposedly protecting him from court predators, the man Lucien had trusted when he trusted no one else. No, Lucien said flatly, not him. Your Grace, I'm merely reporting what the evidence suggests. I said no. Harrington has been loyal to this family for decades. He protected me when my father died. He kept the estate functioning when I was too young to manage it myself. Evelyn touched his shoulder gently. We need to investigate before we dismiss it. Lucien shoved back from the desk, standing with enough force to send his chair crashing backward. You want me to believe the one person who showed me kindness after my father's death has been stealing from me for 5 years? That everything he did was a lie? I want you to look at the evidence without letting emotion cloud your judgment, Evelyn said carefully. His eyes blazed. Don't lecture me about judgment. You've been here 2 months. Harrington's been family my entire life. Then prove me wrong. Investigate and prove the evidence is fabricated. The challenge hung between them. Lucien's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching as he fought the war between loyalty and logic. Fine, he said eventually. Graves, arrange a meeting with Harrington. Tomorrow. Here. As you wish, Your Grace. After Graves left, Evelyn approached Lucien where he stood staring out the window at ground shrouded in early spring rain. I know this is hard, she said quietly. You know nothing about what this is. His voice was raw. Harrington was the only person who didn't treat me like a monster after my father died. The only one who looked at me and saw something worth salvaging. Which makes the betrayal worse if it's true. I understand that. Do you? Do you understand what it means to have one anchor in the storm and discover it was never secured? That you've been drifting the entire time and just didn't know it? Evelyn wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek to his scarred back. I understand that trust is the hardest thing you've ever given anyone, and I understand that having it broken would confirm everything you've believed about love being weakness. His hands covered hers where they rested against his chest. If it's true, if he's been lying all these years, I don't know what that makes me. Fool? Victim? Both? It makes you human. It makes you someone who wanted to believe in loyalty because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative is all I've ever known. Not anymore. Now you have me, and I'm not going anywhere. He turned in her arms, pulled her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her own. You keep saying that, like it's a promise you can keep. It is a promise, one I choose to make every day, even if everything falls apart, especially then. Lord Harrington arrived at noon the following day, all aristocratic charm and avuncular warmth. He was in his 50s, silver threading through dark hair, with the kind of face that suggested kindness and competence in equal measure. Evelyn had met him twice before, brief encounters where he'd been nothing but gracious to the woman who'd married his nephew. Now, watching him settle into the chair across from Lucien's desk, she searched for signs of deception and found nothing but genuine affection in his expression. Lucien, my boy, what's this about? Your message sounded urgent. Lucien slid the leather-bound ledger across the desk. I need you to explain these entries. Harrington opened the book, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. His confusion looked authentic. I don't understand. What am I looking at? 5 years of embezzlement from the Blackthorn estate, payments made to ghost accounts, money siphoned systematically from our holdings. And you think Harrington's face went pale. You think I stole from you? The evidence suggests someone with intimate knowledge of our financial systems, someone who had access during the years after my father's death. Lucien, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this. Harrington stood, his hands spread in a gesture of innocence. I've served this family faithfully for 30 years. I protected you when you were vulnerable. Why would I betray that trust? That's what I need to know. The hurt in Harrington's expression was masterful, if it was acting. If it wasn't, then they were accusing an innocent man of crimes he hadn't committed. May I examine the ledger more closely? Harrington asked. Lucien nodded. Harrington returned to his seat, studying each entry with the focus of someone genuinely trying to understand. His finger traced down one column, stopped, went back. These signatures, he said slowly, they're meant to be mine? Yes. He looked up, and something in his face had shifted. They're good, very good. But they're not mine. Look here, the way the H connects to the A. I don't write that way. Never have. He pulled out his own correspondence, laid it beside the forged signatures. The difference was subtle, but present. A slight variation in the angle, the pressure, the spacing. Someone went to significant effort to frame me, Harrington said. Someone who wanted you to lose faith in the one person you trusted. Or you're an excellent liar, Evelyn said quietly. Harrington's gaze shifted to her, and she saw calculation there. Brief, quickly masked, but present. My lady, I understand your loyalty to my nephew, but I've been protecting him since he was a boy. I would never— Then help us find who did, Lucien interrupted. If you're innocent, prove it. Give us access to your accounts, your correspondence, anything that might clear your name or point us toward the real culprit. The hesitation was barely perceptible. Then Harrington nodded. Of course. Whatever you need. Graves appeared as if summoned. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton is here to see you. He says it's urgent. I'm in the middle of— He says it concerns the royal summons. Lucien's expression went carefully blank. What royal summons? The one that arrived this morning, Your Grace, delivered by royal messenger. You're to appear before the King's court in 3 days to answer charges of financial impropriety and suspicion of treason. The words fell into the study like grenades. Evelyn felt Lucien go rigid beside her, felt the world tilt on its axis as the implications crashed down. Treason, Lucien repeated, his voice dangerously soft. On what grounds? Graves's face was ashen. The charges claim you've been using Blackthorn resources to fund enemies of the crown, that you've been plotting against the king's interests. The evidence was submitted by an anonymous source 3 days ago. 3 days ago. Right after the Ashford dinner, right after Lucien had exposed his vulnerability in front of London's elite. This is absurd, Harrington said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lucien, you must fight this. Demand to see the evidence. Call witnesses. Lucien wasn't listening. He was staring at nothing, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and outcomes, calculating the damage. Who's Pemberton? Evelyn asked. The king's investigator, Graves said. He's been granted authority to search the estate and seize any relevant documents. They're going to find the embezzlement, Evelyn realized. They're going to find evidence of financial irregularities and use it to support the treason charges. It was elegant, really. Someone had been setting this trap for years, bleeding the estate, creating paper trails that could be interpreted as funding sedition, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it. And that moment was now, when Lucien was already vulnerable, already exposed, already isolated from the court that had never fully accepted him. I need to see Pemberton, Lucien said. His voice had gone cold, all emotion locked down behind the fortress walls he'd spent a lifetime building. Graves, show him in. Your Grace, perhaps you should consult with legal counsel first. Now, Graves. The steward bowed and retreated. Harrington stood, adjusting his coat. I should go. Give you privacy to handle this. Stay, Lucien said. If you're innocent, you'll want to hear what they think they have on me. If you're not, I want to watch your face when the truth comes out. It was a test. Harrington passed it by settling back into his chair with an expression of wounded loyalty. Lord Pemberton entered like a man who'd been granted power and intended to use every ounce of it. He was younger than Evelyn expected, 40, perhaps, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who'd climbed the ranks through competence and calculated ambition. Your Grace. He didn't bow, which was a calculated insult. I'm here under authority of the Crown to investigate allegations of treason against your person and holdings. What allegations specifically? Lucian asked. Pemberton produced a document, unfolded it with deliberate precision, that you've been systematically diverting funds from the Blackthorn estate to finance anti-Crown activities, that you've been in communication with known dissidents, that you've used your position to undermine royal interests while maintaining a facade of loyalty. All lies, Lucian said flatly. Then you won't object to a complete audit of your financial records, all correspondence, all business dealings for the past 5 years. Audit away. You'll find nothing because there's nothing to find. Pemberton smiled. It wasn't pleasant. We'll see. I have authority to begin the search immediately. I'll also need to question your staff, your business associates, and, his gaze slid to Evelyn, your wife. My wife has nothing to do with estate business. Nevertheless, she's been living here for 2 months. She may have witnessed activities relevant to our investigation. The trap was closing. Evelyn could see it in Pemberton's confidence, in the way he was already treating Lucian like a guilty man awaiting conviction. When is the court appearance? She asked. 3 days from now. The Duke will present himself before the King and Council to answer the charges. Failure to appear will be taken as admission of guilt. I'll be there, Lucian said. Excellent. Until then, you're confined to the estate. No visitors, no correspondence that isn't screened by my office, no attempts to flee or destroy evidence. Pemberton gestured, and armed guards filed into the study. These men will ensure compliance. You're putting me under house arrest in my own home. I'm protecting the integrity of the investigation. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. He paused. Though I should mention, the penalty for treason is death, confiscation of all properties and titles, complete destruction of your family line. The words hung in the air like an execution order. Harrington stood abruptly. This is outrageous. Lord Pemberton, the Duke deserves the presumption of innocence. The Duke will receive exactly what the law allows. Now, if you'll excuse us, I have work to do. Graves appeared to escort Harrington out. The older man caught Lucien's eye as he passed, and Evelyn saw something flicker between them. Understanding, maybe, or warning. Then he was gone, and they were left with Pemberton and his guards and the crushing weight of an empire collapsing. The search lasted 3 days. Pemberton's men tore through the estate with methodical efficiency, seizing documents, interrogating servants, cataloging everything that might serve as evidence. Evelyn and Lucian were confined to their rooms except for meals, guards posted outside their doors like they were already prisoners. On the second night, Evelyn woke to find Lucian's side of the bed empty. She found him standing at the window staring out at grounds crawling with investigators. They're going to find something, he said without turning. Even if I'm innocent, they'll find something they can twist. That's how these things work. Then we fight it. We prove whatever they find is fabricated or misrepresented. With what? My reputation? My sterling record of stability and trustworthiness? He laughed bitterly. They've already decided I'm guilty. This is just theater to justify the execution. You don't know that. Yes, I do. I've watched it happen to others. The Crown decides someone's too powerful, too dangerous, too unpredictable. They manufacture charges, produce evidence, and remove the threat. It's efficient. Evelyn moved to stand beside him. So, what's the plan? Accept defeat? The plan is to survive long enough to figure out who set this trap and destroy them before they destroy me. His hand found hers in the darkness. The problem is, I have 3 days and no evidence. Whoever did this was smart enough to cover their tracks for 5 years. Finding them now is like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. Then we look for patterns. Who benefits from your destruction? Everyone. The rivals who want my business holdings. The courtiers who think the Blackthorn line should end. The reformers who see old aristocracy as the enemy. Take your pick. What about Harrington? Lucian's jaw tightened. What about him? He had opportunity, access, motive if he wanted to inherit the estate himself. And his reaction when Pemberton mentioned the charges, he didn't seem surprised. You're reaching. Am I? Or are you refusing to see what's obvious because accepting it means accepting you've been manipulated for years? The silence that followed was dangerous. Evelyn felt Lucien's control fracturing, felt the rage and betrayal building toward an explosion. If it's him, he said finally, voice rough with fury barely contained, if he's the one who did this, we'll deal with it, together. No. His hand tightened on hers. If it's him, I'll kill him myself. Slowly, the way my father would have. The words should have horrified her. Instead, she understood them for what they were. Not threat, but promise. The promise of a man who'd been betrayed by everyone he'd ever trusted and was finally ready to stop being victim and become something else entirely. Something terrible. Something necessary. What? The evidence appeared on the morning of the third day. Pemberton summoned them to the study where he'd arranged his findings like a prosecutor building a case. Documents spread across the desk. Ledgers, correspondence, bank records. As you can see, he said with the satisfaction of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for, the financial trail is quite clear. Money flowing from Blackthorn accounts to known dissidents, letters discussing anti-Crown sentiment, records of meetings with individuals later arrested for sedition. Lucien studied the evidence with a calm that was more frightening than rage would have been. These letters aren't in my handwriting. Experts will determine that at trial. And the meetings? I've never met any of these people. You're documented as having attended gatherings where they were present. Attended or was in the same building as? There's a difference. Pemberton's smile sharpened. The court will decide what constitutes evidence of conspiracy. My job is simply to present what I've found. What you've found is a fabrication. Someone planted this evidence, a convenient claim. Do you have proof? Not yet. Then I suggest you find some before your appearance tomorrow. Because as it stands, the case against you is substantial. After Pemberton left, Evelyn watched Lucien systematically examine every piece of evidence, searching for the seam where truth became fiction. His hands were steady, but she could see the cost of that steadiness in the tension radiating through his body. It's brilliant work, he said eventually. Whoever did this understands how investigations work. They created just enough connection to establish pattern without making it obvious fabrication. The handwriting is close enough to mine to suggest I attempted disguise. The meetings are real events I actually attended. They just added seditionists to the guest list retroactively. Can we prove that? Not in time for tomorrow's hearing. The door opened. Graves entered, his expression more grim than Evelyn had ever seen it. Your Grace, I've discovered something. I hesitate to bring it to your attention given the circumstances, but just tell me, Graves. The steward placed a single letter on the desk. This was hidden in Lord Harrington's rooms. I found it while conducting my own investigation into the embezzlement. Lucien picked up the letter, read it, went absolutely still. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder. The letter was addressed to an unnamed recipient, but the content was damning. The Duke's instability makes him the perfect scapegoat. Continue building the financial irregularities. When the time is right, we'll trigger the royal investigation and remove him cleanly. The estate and title will pass to me by right of inheritance, and our arrangement can proceed as planned. It was signed with Harrington's seal. Where exactly did you find this? Lucien's voice was devoid of emotion. Hidden in a book in his study, Your Grace. I believe he meant to destroy it, but was interrupted by the investigation. Or someone planted it there knowing you'd find it, Evelyn said quietly. This is too convenient, too perfect. Graves looked uncomfortable. I suppose that's possible, Your Grace, but the seal is authentic. I verified it against Lord Harrington's other correspondence. Lucien set down the letter with careful precision. Where is he now? Still in London, as far as I know. He's not been back to the estate since the investigation began. Send for him. Tell him I need to see him urgently. Tonight. Your Grace, if he's guilty, then he'll come because he thinks he's won. If he's innocent, he'll come because I'm asking. Either way, I'll have my answer. After Graves left, Evelyn touched Lucien's shoulder. What are you planning? To give him rope. If he's the architect of this trap, he'll hang himself with it. And if he's innocent? If this letter is part of the real conspiracy to turn you against him, then I'll have murdered the one person who actually gave a damn about me, and I'll deserve everything that's coming. The despair in his voice cracked something in Evelyn's chest. She turned him to face her, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever we discover tonight, you are not alone in this. You understand? You're not fighting this battle by yourself anymore. I've always fought alone. Not anymore. Now you have me. And I'm not some fragile thing that breaks when things get hard. I'm not going anywhere, even if this destroys everything. Especially then. He kissed her, hard, desperate, like she was oxygen and he was drowning. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. I don't deserve you, he said roughly. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. Harrington arrived as the sun set, casting the study in shadows that seemed appropriate for confrontation. He entered with the same avuncular warmth, though Evelyn noticed he glanced at the guards posted outside the door before fully committing to the room. Lucienne, thank God. I came as soon as I received Graves's message. How are you holding up? Lucien didn't answer, just pushed the letter across the desk. Harrington read it. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, understanding, hurt. The performance was flawless if it was performance. This is a forgery, he said flatly. I never wrote this. The seal is authentic. Then someone stole my seal. Lucienne, you can't possibly believe I'd betray you like this. Can't I? Someone has. Someone with access, knowledge, opportunity. Someone who stood to inherit everything if I fell. I don't want your estate. I have my own holdings, my own title. What would I gain from destroying you? Power. Influence. The satisfaction of completing what my father started. The accusation hung between them. Harrington's face hardened. Your father was a monster. I spent years trying to undo the damage he did to you. If you truly believe I'd continue his work, then you've learned nothing from all the time I've invested in helping you. Invested? Lucien repeated softly. Interesting choice of words. You're twisting everything. Harrington stood, his composure cracking. I came here tonight because you asked. Because despite everything, I care about what happens to you. But I won't stand here and be accused of crimes I didn't commit based on forged evidence. Then explain the embezzlement. Explain how someone accessed the estate's financial systems without your knowledge. I don't know. But I swear on everything I hold sacred, it wasn't me. The problem, Evelyn said quietly, is that your word isn't enough anymore. Not when the evidence keeps pointing in your direction. Harrington's gaze swung to her, and for just a moment she saw something cold and calculating beneath the wounded dignity. Then it was gone, replaced by aristocratic offense. My lady, I understand you're protective of your husband, but you've been here 2 months. I've known Lucien his entire life. I think I'm better positioned to judge what serves his interests. Really? Evelyn stepped closer. Because from where I'm standing, someone who knew him his entire life would be perfectly positioned to manipulate him, to play on his desperate need for family, for loyalty, for one person who didn't see him as a monster. That kind of manipulation requires intimacy, time, trust. She saw it land, the brief flicker of recognition that she'd touched something true. Harrington recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. You're out of your depth, he said. Maybe. But I'm not blind. Lucien was watching the exchange with predatory focus. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold finality of judgment. I'm going to ask you one question, Uncle, and I'll know if you're lying. Did you orchestrate this conspiracy against me? The silence stretched. Harrington held Lucien's stare, his face a mask of wounded innocence. No. Lucien studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I believe you. Evelyn's head snapped toward him. What? Lucien ignored her. Harrington, I need your help. If you didn't do this, then someone's trying to frame both of us. I need you to use your connections, find out who submitted the evidence to the Crown, trace it back to its source. Of course. Harrington's relief was palpable. Whatever you need. There's a problem, though. Lucien's tone hadn't changed. The problem is you're lying. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Lucien, you flinched when Evelyn mentioned manipulation. Micro-expression, barely visible, but present. And your pupils dilated when I asked the direct question, physiological response to stress that indicates deception. My father taught me to read those signs. Ironic that I'm using his lessons to unmask his brother. Harrington's expression went blank. You're mistaken. Am I? Let's test that theory. Lucien stood, moving around the desk with predatory grace. Tell me about the business deal you made with Lord Wessex 3 months ago. The one where you promised him favorable trade terms once you inherited the Blackthorn holdings. There is no such deal. No? Then explain why Wessex's private correspondence, which Graves obtained through less than legal means, references exactly that arrangement. Dated 2 weeks before the embezzlement started appearing in our ledgers. He was bluffing. Evelyn could tell from the slight tension in his shoulders, but Harrington didn't know that, and the accusation hit its mark. The older man's face transformed. The avuncular warmth evaporated, replaced by something calculating and cold. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. "I thought the damage your father did would have broken you completely. Apparently, I underestimated how much of him survived in you. So you admit it. What's the point in denying?" Harrington gestured at the guards outside. "You're not walking out of this room, Uncle. You might as well satisfy my curiosity before the end." Harrington laughed, bitter, dark, entirely devoid of the warmth he'd shown moments before. "Fine. You want the truth? Your father was supposed to leave the estate to me. I was the competent one, the stable one, the son who actually understood how to wield power. But blood mattered more than merit, so you inherited everything despite being a broken mess of trauma and instability. And you decided to take it anyway. I decided to correct an injustice. I spent 5 years bleeding the estate slowly enough that you wouldn't notice, building the financial evidence that would support treason charges, cultivating relationships with court officials who'd be sympathetic to removing an unstable duke. It was elegant, really. By the time you realized what was happening, the trap would be sprung. Why tell me this now? Because, nephew, you're going to die tomorrow. Either by execution after the court finds you guilty, or by convenient accident if you somehow manage to escape. Either way, the Blackthorn line ends with you, and I finally get what should have been mine from the beginning." He pulled a pistol from his coat, small, easily concealed, and pointed directly at Lucien's chest. "The guards outside won't interfere. They're loyal to the crown, not to you. And when they find your body, the letter I'm going to leave will confess your guilt and express your inability to live with the shame. Tragic, neat, final." Evelyn moved instinctively toward Lucien. Harrington's aim shifted to her. "Don't, my dear. You're collateral damage, I'm afraid. Can't have you running to the authorities with inconvenient truths." The gun was steady. Harrington's finger rested on the trigger, and Evelyn understood with crystalline clarity that they were about to die in this study, murdered by the man Lucien had trusted most, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. Except Lucien was smiling, not warmly, not with humor, with the cold satisfaction of a trap springing exactly as planned. "You're going to want to put the gun down, Uncle." "Why would I do that? Because you've just confessed to conspiracy, embezzlement, and attempted murder in front of witnesses." Harrington laughed. "What witnesses? The guards outside can't hear through these doors." "Not them." Lucien gestured to the far corner of the study where a panel slid open and Lord Pemberton stepped out, flanked by 2 investigators. "Them." Harrington's face went white. The gun wavered. Pemberton moved with professional efficiency, his own weapon drawn and aimed. "Lord Harrington, you're under arrest for treason, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and crimes against the crown. Drop the weapon." For a moment, Evelyn thought Harrington might actually fire. Saw him calculate the odds, consider his options, decide whether taking Lucien down with him was worth it. Then Graves appeared behind him, moving with surprising speed for a man his age, and disarmed him with practiced efficiency. Harrington was dragged from the study, still sputtering protests and threats. The door closed behind him, leaving Lucien, Evelyn, and Pemberton in heavy silence. "That was quite the performance, Your Grace," Pemberton said. "I almost believed you were actually accusing your wife of manipulation there. It had to be convincing." Lucien's voice was flat, exhausted. Harrington's smart. Anything less than complete authenticity would have tipped him off. Evelyn's mind was racing to catch up. "You planned this. The letter, the accusation, all of it. You knew he'd confess if you pushed the right way. Not knew. Hoped." Lucien met her eyes, and she saw the devastation there beneath the control. "I needed proof. The only way to get it was to make him believe he'd won, that he could gloat before killing me. You gambled your life on a psychological profile. I gambled both our lives." He looked away. "I'm sorry. I should have told you, but I couldn't risk you giving it away. Your reactions had to be genuine. The betrayal of that, the calculated manipulation, stung more than Evelyn wanted to admit. But beneath it, she understood the necessity. Understood that Lucien had learned to weaponize his damage because survival demanded it. Pemberton cleared his throat. The charges against you will be dropped, Your Grace. Harrington's confession clears you completely. You're free to attend tomorrow's hearing and request formal exoneration. Thank you, Lord Pemberton. Though I should mention the investigation into your father's death will be reopened. Harrington made several references to events surrounding it that warrant further scrutiny. Do what you need to do. I just want the truth. After Pemberton left, Evelyn and Lucien stood in the study that had become a stage for betrayal and revelation. The silence between them felt fragile, loaded with everything unsaid. You used me, Evelyn said finally. Used my reactions as part of your performance. Yes. You made me believe we were investigating together when really you'd already set the trap. Yes. Do you understand how that feels? After everything we've shared, everything I've given you, to discover you still don't trust me enough to include me in your plans? Lucien turned to face her fully, and the raw pain in his expression nearly undid her. I understand that I've just destroyed the only real thing I've ever had, because I'm fundamentally incapable of trusting anyone completely. I understand that you're going to leave now because I've proven I'm exactly what I warned you I was. Someone who destroys everything good in his life. I'm not leaving. His breath caught. What? I'm furious with you. I'm hurt. I'm questioning whether you'll ever be able to let someone all the way in. Evelyn moved closer. But I'm not leaving. Because for the first time since I met you, you just chose survival over self-destruction. You used your damage as a weapon instead of letting it consume you. That's not perfect, but it's progress. Progress that hurt you. Yes. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to establish that this doesn't happen again without my knowledge. Evelyn touched his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. But you survived, Lucien. You took the worst betrayal possible and turned it into victory. You didn't let Harrington destroy you. That matters more than your methods. He pulled her close, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and unstable. I don't know how to do this, he said against her hair. How to be someone who trusts, who shares plans instead of executing them alone, who lets people in without keeping exit strategies ready. Then we'll learn together. We'll fail, we'll fight, we'll hurt each other because neither of us knows how to love without our damage getting in the way. But we'll keep choosing each other anyway. Why? Because the alternative is going back to who we were before. Alone. Isolated. Convinced we're not worth the risk. And I'd rather fight through this with you than survive safely by myself. Outside, dawn was breaking over the estate. The investigation was over. The traitor was captured. The Duke's name would be cleared and his holdings secured. But inside, in the wreckage of trust tested and barely surviving, Evelyn and Lucien held each other and understood that this was the real battle. Not against external enemies, but against the internal conviction that they didn't deserve the thing they'd found. And for the first time in his life, Lucien chose to fight for something instead of against it. Chose to believe that maybe, possibly, love wasn't the weakness his father had taught him it was. Maybe it was the only strength that actually mattered. The thought terrified him more than any threat Harrington had made, but he didn't let go. The royal court assembled like vultures gathering around a corpse that hadn't stopped breathing yet. Evelyn stood beside Lucien in the anteroom, watching through the gap in the heavy doors as nobles filed into the chamber with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed anticipation of bloodshed. They wanted a show. They wanted to watch the Mad Duke either vindicate himself or burn spectacularly. They were going to get more than they bargained for. Lucien's hand found hers squeezed once. His face was a mask of aristocratic composure, but she could feel the tension radiating through him like electricity before a storm. This was the moment everything either validated or collapsed. The hearing that would either clear his name or confirm every whispered accusation that had followed him since birth. "You ready?" she asked quietly. "No, but that's never stopped me before." The doors opened. A herald announced them with all the formal ceremony that accompanied a duke's entrance, though Evelyn noticed the slight hesitation before he said Lucien's title, like even the herald wasn't sure if it would still apply by day's end. They walked into the chamber side by side. Every eye tracked their movement down the center aisle toward the dais where the king sat flanked by his council. Evelyn had never seen the king in person before. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with the kind of face that suggested he'd survived decades of court intrigue by being sharper than everyone around him. His gaze settled on Lucien with calculation that made Evelyn's spine straighten. This wasn't a man who'd be swayed by emotion or appeals to fairness. This was someone who'd measure Lucian against political utility and act accordingly. "Duke Blackthorn," the king said, his voice carried through the chamber with practiced authority. "You stand accused of treason, conspiracy against the crown, and financial crimes that suggest systematic sedition. How do you answer these charges?" "Not guilty, Your Majesty. On all counts." A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles. The king raised one hand and silence crashed down like a physical weight. "Lord Pemberton has submitted evidence that paints a rather different picture. Would you care to explain the documented payments to known enemies of the state?" "I would, Your Majesty. With your permission, I'd like to present evidence of my own." "Proceed," Lucien gestured. Graves stepped forward, carrying the documents they'd assembled through 3 days of frantic investigation after Harrington's arrest: bank records, correspondence, testimony from servants who'd witnessed the embezzlement. But more than that, they'd found the connections. The web of conspiracy that stretched beyond Harrington into corners of the court itself. "The payments Your Majesty references were indeed made from Blackthorn accounts," Lucien began. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of someone who'd learned to present strength even when bleeding internally. "However, they were made without my knowledge or authorization by my uncle, Lord Harrington, who has confessed to orchestrating a 5-year conspiracy to frame me for treason while systematically stealing from the estate he hoped to inherit." Another murmur, louder this time. The king's expression didn't change. "Lord Harrington has been arrested and charged," Lucien continued. "His confession is documented and witnessed by Lord Pemberton himself. But the conspiracy doesn't end with him." He pulled out the final piece of evidence, the correspondence they'd found hidden in Harrington's effects. Letters from members of the king's own council discussing the benefits of removing an unstable duke and redistributing Blackthorn holdings among more reliable families. Evelyn watched the king's face as Lucien named names, saw recognition flicker, saw calculation sharpen. These weren't accusations you made lightly in open court unless you had proof so solid it couldn't be dismissed. Lucien had that proof, and he was burning bridges with every word, cutting ties with the very people who might have been political allies if he'd been willing to play the game quietly. But quiet had never saved anyone. Evelyn had learned that watching her husband fight his way out of traps designed by people who thought they were smarter than him. Sometimes survival demanded you set everything on fire and walk through the flames. "You're making serious allegations, Duke Blackthorn," the king said. "Allegations that implicate members of my council in conspiracy against your person. I'm presenting facts, Your Majesty. What you choose to do with them is your prerogative, but I won't stand here and accept guilt for crimes orchestrated by men who used my family's reputation as cover for their own sedition." It was a gamble, a massive, terrifying gamble that depended entirely on the king valuing truth over political convenience. If he decided protecting his council mattered more than justice, Lucien was finished regardless of evidence. The king stood. The chamber went silent. "This court will recess while I examine the evidence presented." "Duke Blackthorn, you will remain in custody until a decision is reached." Custody. Not prison, but not freedom either. Guards moved forward to flank Lucien. Evelyn started to follow and was stopped by a hand on her arm, one of the council members whose name had appeared in those letters. "The Duchess will remain here," the man said. His smile was cold. "We have questions about her role in these accusations." Evelyn looked at Lucien, saw the flash of fury in his eyes, quickly suppressed, saw him calculate odds and outcomes and recognize that fighting this would only make things worse. "Answer their questions," he said quietly. "Tell them the truth." Then he was led away and Evelyn was surrounded by men who'd just been publicly accused of conspiracy and were looking for someone to punish for the exposure. They questioned her for 3 hours in a side chamber that felt deliberately intimidating. High ceilings, cold stone, chairs positioned to make her feel small and isolated. 5 council members, all older men who'd spent decades wielding power, all furious at being outmaneuvered by a duke they'd written off as damaged goods. "Tell us about your husband's mental state," Lord Wessex demanded. He was the one who'd grabbed her arm earlier, a broad man with the face of someone who enjoyed cruelty when he could justify it. "Does he suffer episodes? Delusions?" "My husband is perfectly sane, yet he claims members of this council conspired against him. That's either truth or paranoid fantasy." "It's truth. I've seen the evidence. Evidence can be fabricated." Wessex leaned forward. Confessions can be coerced. Your husband has every reason to create a conspiracy where none exists. It deflects from his own crimes. He committed no crimes. So you say. But you've been married, what, 2 months? Hardly enough time to truly know a man, especially one with the Blackthorne family history. Another council member, Lord Perth, thin and sharp-featured, cut in. We have testimony from servants at Blackthorne Manor describing the Duke's violent tendencies. Rage episodes, destruction of property, screaming in the night. Evelyn felt ice slide down her spine. They'd interviewed the staff, had found servants willing to trade gossip for favor or coin or simple self-preservation. My husband has nightmares, she said carefully. Result of childhood trauma. That's not insanity. Trauma inflicted by his father, who was himself unstable. Mental weakness runs in bloodlines, Duchess. Perhaps the Blackthorne line has simply run its course. Perhaps you're terrified that a duke you thought you could control has proven smarter than you anticipated. The words landed like slaps. Wessex's face darkened. Careful, girl. You're in no position to make accusations. Neither were you. Yet here we are. Perth smiled without warmth. Your loyalty is admirable. Misplaced, but admirable. Unfortunately, loyalty doesn't change facts. Your husband is damaged, unstable, dangerous. The kingdom would be better served with the Blackthorne holdings distributed among families capable of responsible stewardship. You mean among yourselves, among those who've proven their reliability to the crown. Evelyn stood, tired of being made to feel small. You want to know what I've learned in 2 months? I've learned my husband is the strongest person I've ever met. Not because he's undamaged, because he survived damage that would have destroyed anyone else and kept functioning. You call that weakness. I call it the kind of strength kingdoms are built on. Strength doesn't scream itself awake every night. No, surviving despite that does. The door opened. A guard entered, whispered something to Wessex. The council member's expression went carefully neutral. It appears the king has reached a decision. You'll be escorted to the main chamber. The court had reassembled by the time Evelyn was brought back. Lucien was already there, standing before the dais with the kind of rigid control that suggested he was holding himself together through pure will. His eyes found hers across the room, and she saw the question there. Are you all right? Overlaid with fury at having been separated. She nodded slightly. Whatever they'd tried during interrogation, she'd survived it. The king stood. The chamber fell silent with the weight of judgment about to be pronounced. After reviewing the evidence presented by Duke Blackthorne and conducting investigation into the allegations made, I have reached the following conclusions. Evelyn's heart hammered. Beside her, she felt the collective-held breath of nobles waiting to see which way power would fall. The charges of treason against Duke Blackthorne are dismissed. The evidence clearly shows a conspiracy orchestrated by Lord Harrington with assistance from members of my council who sought personal gain through the Duke's destruction. Relief crashed through Evelyn so hard she swayed. Lucien's shoulders didn't relax. He knew better than to celebrate before the full verdict came down. However, the king continued, his voice hardening, the question of the Duke's fitness to maintain his holdings remains under scrutiny. Mental instability, even if not criminal, poses risks to those under his authority and to the stability of the realm. No. Evelyn felt the trap closing even as Lucien's face went blank. Therefore, I am appointing a regent to oversee Blackthorne affairs, until such time as the Duke demonstrates sustained capacity for responsible governance. This regent will have full authority over financial decisions, estate management, and— With respect, Your Majesty, Lucien interrupted. His voice cut through the chamber like a blade. I've just proven my competence by unmasking a conspiracy that your own intelligence failed to detect. I've demonstrated both the capability and will to protect my holdings against internal and external threats. On what grounds do you question my fitness? The king's expression didn't change. On the grounds that multiple witnesses have testified to behavior suggesting profound psychological damage. Violent outbursts. Inability to maintain stable relationships. Patterns consistent with your father's well-documented instability. My father was a sadistic monster who enjoyed inflicting pain. I am a man dealing with the consequences of his abuse. Those are not the same thing. Perhaps not. But the risk to those in your care— I'll speak to that risk, Evelyn said. Every eye turned to her. She stepped forward, heart pounding but voice steady. Your Majesty, I am the person most in the Duke's care. I live with him, share his life daily. If anyone would know whether he poses danger, it would be me. And your assessment? The king asked. That my husband is the most controlled person I've ever met. Yes, he carries damage. Yes, he struggles with trauma from systematic abuse, but he has never once directed violence toward me or anyone under his protection. The outbursts your witnesses describe are reactions to stress, not patterns of instability. You've known him 2 months. I've known him in ways most people never achieve in a lifetime. I've seen him at his worst and his most vulnerable. I've watched him choose restraint when rage would have been easier. I've witnessed the strength it takes to function when your own mind is a battlefield. She moved closer to the dais, aware she was breaking protocol, but beyond caring. You want to talk about fitness to govern? My husband just exposed a conspiracy that reached into your own council. He did it while under investigation, while confined to his estate, while facing execution if he failed. That's not instability. That's brilliance under pressure. The king studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Loyalty is admirable, Duchess, but it can also blind us to harsh truth. Then test him. Give him a year to prove his competence. Monitor his decisions if you must. But don't strip away his authority based on testimony from servants who've been bribed or frightened into saying whatever advances someone else's agenda. Lord Wessex stood abruptly. Your Majesty, the girl is emotional and clearly biased. The girl, Evelyn said coldly, is the Duchess of Blackthorn. And unlike the men who conspired against my husband, my bias doesn't extend to treason. Wessex's face went purple. Perth looked like he'd tasted something foul. But several other council members, ones whose names hadn't appeared in Harrington's letters, were nodding slightly. The king raised his hand. Silence fell again. You argue passionately, Duchess, and you raise valid points about the Duke's recent demonstration of capability. He paused. Evelyn felt Lucien's tension from across the room, felt the entire chamber holding its breath. Therefore, I am modifying my initial ruling. Duke Blackthorn will retain full authority over his holdings, subject to quarterly review by a council appointee of my choosing. Should there be evidence of incompetence or instability during this review period, we will revisit the question of regency. Is this acceptable, Your Grace? It was a compromise, not full vindication, but not destruction either. Lucien would keep his power, but remain under scrutiny. Yes, Your Majesty, Lucien said. Thank you. The king's gaze shifted. And you will attend court functions regularly. No more hiding in your estate. If you wish to dispel questions about your fitness, you'll need to be seen functioning in society. I understand. Excellent. As for the conspirators, the king's voice went cold as winter stone. Lord Harrington will stand trial for treason. Lords Wessex and Perth, your involvement in this conspiracy warrants investigation. You are stripped of your council positions pending review. The two men looked like they'd been struck. Wessex started to protest and was silenced by the king's stare. This court is adjourned. The chamber erupted into chaos. Nobles discussing and dissecting what had just happened, guards moving to escort the disgraced council members out, clerks rushing to document the proceedings. Evelyn pushed through the crowd toward Lucien. He met her halfway, pulling her into an embrace that was probably inappropriate for court, but neither of them cared. She felt his heart hammering against her chest, felt the tremor in his hands that betrayed how close they'd come to complete destruction. You were magnificent, he said roughly against her hair. I just told the truth. You challenged the king, defended me in open court, put yourself between me and political destruction. That's what people do when they love someone. The words slipped out before she could stop them. She felt Lucien go still. What did you say? Evelyn pulled back enough to look at his face. She'd meant to be more careful about this admission, more strategic about when and how she said it. But standing in the wreckage of a court battle they'd barely survived, with his arms around her and his heart beating against hers, careful seemed pointless. I said I love you. I know the timing is terrible, and this probably isn't how you wanted to hear it, but he kissed her. Right there in the middle of the royal court chamber with half of London's aristocracy watching. Kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, like she was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. I don't deserve you, he said. You've mentioned that. Multiple times, I mean it. You could have let me burn. Should have, probably. Would have been safer. Safer isn't always better. It's smarter, maybe. But love isn't about smart decisions. It's about choosing someone despite every logical reason not to, and deciding that's worth whatever comes next. Even when what comes next is quarterly reviews and mandatory court appearances and living under scrutiny? Especially then. Lucienne's hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. I can't promise to be easy. Can't promise I won't have episodes or push you away when the damage gets too loud. Can't promise I know how to do this without destroying it eventually. Then we'll learn together. Figure out how to love around the damage. Build something that survives the worst we can throw at it. That's a terrible plan. It's the only plan I've got. He kissed her again, softer this time. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I love you too. I've been terrified of saying it because everything I love gets destroyed, but there it is. I love you, and I have no idea what to do with that. Start by accepting it. Evelyn smiled. We'll work out the rest as we go. They were halfway to the carriage when Lord Pemberton intercepted them. His expression was grim in a way that made Evelyn's stomach clench. Your Grace, I need to speak with you, privately. Lucien's hand tightened on Evelyn's. Anything you need to say can be said in front of my wife. Pemberton glanced around at the nobles still filing out of the court chamber. Not here. Your estate. Tonight. What's this about? Information that came to light during Harrington's interrogation. Information that changes everything we thought we knew about your father's death. The words landed like physical blows. Lucien went very still. My father died in a riding accident 5 years ago. What's there to know? That it wasn't an accident. Pemberton's voice dropped. That it was murder. And your uncle wasn't the only one involved. But the study at Blackthorn Manor felt different now, less like a fortress and more like a command center preparing for war. Pemberton spread documents across the desk while Lucien paced like a caged predator, and Evelyn tried to process what they were hearing. During interrogation, Harrington revealed details about your father's death that suggest premeditation, Pemberton explained. He claims the old Duke was becoming increasingly unstable, that he'd started making threats against family members who opposed him. Harrington and several others decided intervention was necessary. Intervention meaning murder, meaning removing a threat before he could do more damage. Pemberton's tone was carefully neutral. According to Harrington, your father had started planning to alter his will, was going to disinherit you entirely, name Harrington his heir despite the title passing by blood. Lucien stopped pacing. That's a lie. My father would never— Your father hated you, Pemberton interrupted. His words to Harrington were that you were weak, damaged, an embarrassment to the Blackthorn name. He wanted to ensure the estate passed to someone capable. The cruelty of it hit Evelyn like a fist. Even in death, Lucien's father was inflicting damage. So Harrington killed him to prevent the disinheritance? She asked. Harrington claims it was self-defense on your behalf, that he was protecting you from complete destruction. How generous of him, Lucien said, his voice acid. And the others involved? Pemberton consulted his notes. 3 other lords who stood to benefit from redistributing Blackthorn holdings if you'd been disinherited. They helped stage the riding accident, made sure the investigation concluded it was misadventure rather than murder. He looked up. The problem is this puts you in an interesting position, Your Grace. If this information becomes public, you're the primary beneficiary of your father's murder. That raises questions about whether you knew or were involved. Evelyn felt ice slide through her veins. You're saying someone could accuse Lucien of patricide? I'm saying the optics are complicated. The son who inherits everything after his abusive father dies under suspicious circumstances. It's the kind of story people love to believe regardless of evidence. Lucien had gone very quiet. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. What do you suggest? Pemberton hesitated. Officially? Let it go. Your father's death was ruled an accident. Harrington is already facing execution for treason. Opening this investigation only creates new problems without solving old ones. And unofficially, I think you deserve to know the truth about how your father died and who was responsible. But truth and justice aren't always the same thing. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Evelyn watched Lucien process this. Another betrayal, another lie, another person who'd claimed to protect him while serving their own interests. I want their names, Lucien said finally. Everyone involved in my father's murder. Your Grace. Their names. Now. Pemberton sighed, pulled out another document. 5 names total. 3 of them were lords who'd supported Harrington's conspiracy against Lucian. The other 2 were surprises, men who'd been publicly sympathetic to Lucian after his father's death, who'd offered support and guidance. All of them liars. All of them complicit. "What are you planning to do?" Pemberton asked carefully. Lucien looked at the list of names, and Eveline saw something shift in his expression. Not rage, though that was there. Something colder, more calculated. "Nothing illegal," he said. "But these men murdered my father and then tried to destroy me when I became inconvenient. They're going to learn what happens when you create a monster and then fail to kill it properly." The campaign began that night and would unfold over the next 3 weeks with the precision of a military operation. Lucian didn't move against his enemies directly. That would have been obvious and invited retaliation. Instead, he used every lesson his father had beaten into him about wielding power through pressure points and proxy wars. Lord Ashford, one of the men who'd helped stage the writing accident, found his investments suddenly going bad. Contracts falling through. Business partners backing out mysteriously. Within a week, he was hemorrhaging money fast enough that bankruptcy loomed. Lord Perth's son, the heir to his title and fortune, was caught in a scandal involving gambling debts and forged documents. The kind of scandal that destroyed reputations and resulted in disinheritance. Perth had been willing to help murder a duke to protect his family legacy. Now he watched that legacy crumble because his son had been manipulated into disaster by people Perth never saw coming. The third conspirator simply disappeared. Left London suddenly, some said for health reasons. Others whispered he'd fled ahead of an investigation into financial crimes that would have landed him in prison. Eveline watched Lucian orchestrate this destruction with the cold efficiency of someone who'd finally stopped pulling punches. He'd learned the game from a master of cruelty, and now he was applying those lessons without the hesitation that had held him back before. It should have frightened her, this glimpse of what Lucien could become when he stopped trying to be better than his father. But instead, she felt a fierce pride watching him dismantle the men who'd thought he was too damaged to be dangerous. "You're enjoying this," she said one night as they reviewed the latest reports on Ashford's financial collapse. "Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human. They hurt you. They tried to destroy you. Wanting them to suffer for it isn't wrong. My father would have just killed them." "You're not your father. You're giving them the same thing they gave you, slow destruction, while wondering when the next blow will fall. That's almost poetic." Lucian pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Sometimes I worry you're making me worse instead of better. Or maybe I'm just giving you permission to be exactly as ruthless as you need to be. There's a difference between cruelty for its own sake and strategic devastation of your enemies. That's a fine line. You'll know if you cross it. And I'll tell you if I see it happening." He kissed her temple. "What did I do to deserve you? Survived long enough for me to show up." The final confrontation came 3 weeks after the court hearing at a royal banquet neither of them could avoid attending. The king had made it clear Lucien was expected to participate in court society, to prove his stability through visibility. So they went, dressed for battle in formal wear that cost more than most people earned in a year. The ballroom blazed with light and laughter, and the particular brand of vicious politeness that characterized aristocratic gatherings. Eveline moved through it on Lucien's arm, hyper-aware of every whisper, every sidelong glance, every assessment of whether the Mad Duke had truly been reformed or was simply hiding his damage better. Lord Ashford approached them near the refreshment table. He looked haggard, the financial pressure clearly taking its toll. His smile was strained. "Your Grace, Duchess, lovely to see you." "Lord Ashford." Lucian's tone was perfectly polite and completely cold. "I heard about your recent difficulties. Terrible luck." "Yes. Quite inexplicable, really. Almost feels orchestrated. Business is unpredictable. Sometimes patterns emerge that seem intentional but are merely confluence of unfortunate circumstances." The threat was barely veiled. Ashford's jaw tightened. "Perhaps, or perhaps some people never forget grievances and use their power to settle old scores." "If I had grievances," Eveline cut in smoothly, "I'd probably focus on people who conspired to murder my father-in-law and then tried to destroy my husband. Those seem worth remembering." Ashford went pale. "You can't prove—" "We don't need to prove anything," Lucian said. "The court of public opinion operates on suspicion and pattern recognition, and the pattern around you is becoming quite clear. This is harassment. No, this is consequence. You helped kill a man, helped frame me for crimes I didn't commit, and thought you'd get away with it because I was too damaged to fight back. You were wrong." He stepped closer, voice dropping to something only Ashford could hear. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw from society, claim health concerns, family obligations, anything that gets you out of London, and you're going to live very quietly for the rest of your life, knowing that if you ever move against me or mine again, I'll finish what I started. Do you understand?" Ashford's face cycled through several expressions: fury, fear, calculation. Finally, he nodded. "Crystal clear, Your Grace." He walked away. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was dangerous," she said quietly. "Necessary. These men needed to understand that I'm not the boy they could manipulate anymore." "What about the ones who helped you? The lords who testified on your behalf during the conspiracy?" "They get left alone. I'm ruthless, not indiscriminate." The music changed. Lucian offered his hand. "Dance with me? You hate dancing." "I'm learning to tolerate things I hate if they involve you." She let him lead her onto the floor. They moved through the steps with the easy coordination of two people who'd learned to anticipate each other's movements, who'd fought enough battles together that a waltz felt simple by comparison. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked as they turned. "Now we rebuild. Restore the estate's finances, repair our reputation, prove to the king and everyone else that I'm capable of governing responsibly." That sounds boring. Probably will be. No more conspiracies, no more court battles, just the mundane work of running an empire and attending tedious functions. I can live with tedious. Can you? Because I'm not going to be easy, Evelyn. The nightmares aren't going to magically disappear. The damage doesn't heal just because we won. I know. But we'll deal with it the same way we've dealt with everything else. Together, imperfectly, figuring it out as we go. The music swelled. Other couples swirled around them, a sea of silk and jewels and calculated social positioning. But in that moment, Evelyn only saw Lucian, scarred, dangerous, desperately trying to believe he deserved the happiness they'd fought for. "I love you," he said quietly, in case I haven't mentioned it recently. "You mentioned it 3 hours ago. Felt worth repeating." She smiled. "I love you too, even when you're orchestrating the financial ruin of your enemies. Especially then. The song ended. They stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people who'd written Lucian off as damaged goods, and Evelyn felt the weight of everything they'd survived. The arranged marriage neither wanted, the conspiracy that nearly destroyed them, the betrayals and battles and desperate fights for survival. They'd won. Not cleanly, not without cost, but they'd won. And then the ballroom doors burst open and guards poured in, and Lord Pemberton appeared looking grimmer than Evelyn had ever seen him. "Your Grace," he called across the suddenly silent room, "I need you to come with me. Now." "What's happened?" Lucian demanded. "Lord Harrington escaped custody an hour ago. He killed 3 guards, acquired weapons, and left a message." Pemberton's voice carried through the ballroom. "He's coming for you. And he says this time, he's going to finish what he started." The carriage ride back to Blackthorn Manor felt like racing toward the edge of a cliff. Neither of them could see, but both knew was there. Lucien sat rigid beside Evelyn, his mind clearly calculating angles and outcomes while Pemberton's guards flanked them on horseback. The ballroom had erupted into chaos after the announcement. Nobles fleeing, guards mobilizing. The king himself demanding updates on the escaped prisoner who'd made it clear he intended to finish murdering the one person who'd exposed his crimes. Harrington had nothing left to lose. That made him the most dangerous kind of enemy, one who'd already accepted his own destruction and was determined to take Lucien down with him. "How many guards at the estate?" Lucien asked Pemberton, who rode in the carriage with them. 20 as of an hour ago. I've sent word to double that number, but they won't arrive before we do." "Not enough. Harrington knows the manor better than anyone except Graves. He'll know ways in that guards won't think to cover. Then we don't go to the manor. We go somewhere defensible, wait for reinforcements." "No." Lucian's voice was flat. "He wants me to run. Wants me terrified and scattered. I'm done running from men who think my damage makes me weak." "This isn't about pride, Your Grace. This is about survival. It's about both. I survive by proving I'm not the broken thing everyone assumes I am. I do that by facing him on my ground, my terms." Evelyn touched his hand. "The guards will be slaughtered if he gets inside. You know that." She saw the war in his expression, the part that wanted to protect everyone fighting the part that understood sometimes protection meant accepting casualties. It was a terrible calculation, the kind leaders made when every option involved blood. "We evacuate the staff," Lucian said finally. "Everyone except Graves and those willing to stay and fight. The rest get sent to the village until this is over. That's still not enough people to hold the manor if Harrington comes with the men Pemberton says he recruited. Then we make it enough. We turn the manor into a fortress the way it was meant to be, and we hold until dawn when reinforcements arrive." Pemberton looked like he wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. This wasn't a debate. This was Lucien making the choice between fleeing and fighting, and everything in his history said he'd choose fighting even if it destroyed him. They reached the estate as twilight bled into darkness. The manor rose from the grounds like something carved from shadow and stone, beautiful and terrible, and built by men who'd understood that power required fortification. Lucian had spent his whole life treating it as a prison. Now he'd transform it into a weapon. The evacuation happened with military efficiency. Servants filed out through the main gates in carriages commandeered from the stables, while Graves supervised with the calm of a man who'd seen worse. Annie paused at the door, looking back at Evelyn with frightened eyes. "You should come with us, ma'am. This isn't safe." "I know, but I'm staying anyway." The girl nodded like she'd expected that answer and climbed into the carriage. Within 30 minutes, the estate was emptied of everyone except the 20 guards, Graves, Pemberton, and the Duke and Duchess who'd chosen to stand their ground. Lucian moved through the manor like a general preparing for siege, barricaded windows on the ground floor, positioned guards at strategic points, set lanterns in places that would illuminate approaches while keeping defenders in shadow. Evelyn watched him work and saw not the damaged man who'd married her out of necessity, but the Duke his father had tried to create, cold, calculating, ruthless when circumstances demanded it. The difference was Lucian had learned to weaponize those traits without letting them consume his humanity entirely. His father had been cruel for cruelty's sake. Lucian was dangerous because he'd learned the cost of mercy and chosen to pay it anyway when he could afford to. "You should be in the safest room," Lucian said as he checked the barricade on the study windows. "Upstairs, away from entry points. I should be wherever you are. Evelyn, we've had this argument multiple times. I'm not hiding while you fight. This isn't a conspiracy we can outmaneuver with evidence and strategy. This is violence. Blood. People dying. I know." She moved closer, made him look at her. "And I know you want to protect me by locking me away somewhere safe, but we're past that. We're past you fighting alone while I wait to see if you survive." His hands came up to frame her face. "If something happens to you because I let you stay, then it happens. But at least we'll be together. That's not comfort. It's all I've got." He kissed her, hard and desperate, and tasting of fear he wouldn't voice. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "I love you," he said, "and I'm terrified that's going to get you killed. Love doesn't get people killed. Cowards with weapons and vendettas do that. Philosophical distinction, important one." Pemberton appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, we have movement on the south perimeter. Looks like a dozen men approaching through the woods." The words settled over the room like frost. This was it, the final confrontation between the nephew who'd survived his father's cruelty and the uncle who'd thought that survival made him weak enough to exploit. Lucien's expression went cold and focused. All guards to defensive positions. No one engages until they breach the outer wall. I want to see how they approach before we show our hand. The manor transformed into something waiting and watchful. Guards crouched behind cover, weapons ready. Lanterns flickered in windows, casting dancing shadows that made it impossible to count defenders from outside. And in the center of it all, Lucien stood in the main hall with Evelyn beside him and waited for his uncle to make the first move. They didn't wait long. The attack came at midnight exactly, a dozen men hitting 3 entry points simultaneously, while Harrington's voice echoed across the grounds from somewhere in the darkness. "Lucien, come out and face me like a man instead of hiding behind guards and stone walls, or are you still the coward your father always said you were?" The taunt was designed to provoke, to make Lucien do something stupid like charging out to meet him. Instead, Lucien moved to the window, staying carefully in shadow, and assessed the assault. The men breaching the manor weren't soldiers. They were hired muscle, competent enough but not trained for coordinated siege. They'd break through eventually through sheer numbers, but it would take time. Time was all Lucian needed. "Hold positions," he called to the guards. "Let them waste energy on the barricades. When they breach, we fall back to the second defensive line. It was a strategy designed to bleed the attackers through attrition while preserving his own forces. Cold, calculating, exactly the kind of tactical thinking his father had beaten into him through years of lessons disguised as punishment. The irony wasn't lost on Evelyn. Lucian was using the tools of his trauma to survive the consequences of that same trauma. It was circular and brutal and somehow fitting. The first barricade broke 20 minutes later. 3 of Harrington's men poured through the shattered window, only to find themselves facing guards positioned behind overturned furniture with clear lines of fire. 2 went down immediately. The third retreated, shouting warnings to the others outside. Harrington's voice came again, closer now. "You can't hold forever, nephew. I've got men and time and nothing to lose. Eventually you'll run out of ammunition, or will, or both." "Then come get me yourself," Lucien shouted back. "Stop hiding behind hired help and face the nephew you tried to destroy." The challenge hung in the night air. For a moment, Evelyn thought Harrington might actually take it. Then his laughter echoed across the grounds, ugly and knowing. "You think I'm stupid enough to give you a fair fight? I learned from your father, boy. Never give your enemy the advantage, never offer mercy, never hesitate when blood needs to be spilled. Then you learn nothing, because my father's lessons got him murdered by the people he thought he controlled." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Then Harrington's voice again, colder. "Your father was weak at the end, started to feel guilt for what he'd done to you. Started talking about making amends, changing his will, giving you a chance to prove yourself. I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let him undo years of careful planning because he developed a conscience in his final days. So you killed him. I saved you from being disinherited. Should have let me finish the job and taken over the estate yourself. We could have ruled this empire together. Instead, you had to develop morals and loyalty and all those weaknesses that make you vulnerable. More windows shattered. More of Harrington's men breached the defenses. The guards were holding, but barely. Each wave pushed deeper into the manor, forcing defenders back inch by bloody inch. Pemberton appeared beside Lucian, breathing hard. "We can't hold much longer. They're going to overwhelm us through sheer numbers. How long until reinforcements?" 2 hours. Maybe 3. We don't have 3 hours. Then we need a new strategy. Lucien was silent for a moment, thinking. Then his expression shifted, not to fear, but to the cold calculation of a man making a terrible choice because the alternative was worse. "I'm going out there." Evelyn grabbed his arm. "That's suicide." "Probably. But it's also the only way to end this without everyone in this manor dying. Harrington wants me. If I give him what he wants, he'll call off the attack. And then he'll kill you. Maybe. Or maybe I'm faster, better, more desperate." His hand covered hers where it gripped his arm. "I spent my entire childhood learning to survive violence. Time to see if those lessons were worth the cost. No, there has to be another way. There isn't. And you know it." He was right. Evelyn could see it in Pemberton's grim expression, in the sounds of combat getting closer, in the reality that holding this position was delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. "Absolutely not. You don't get to make that choice for me." "Evelyn," his voice broke. "Please, if you stay here, at least you have a chance. Out there, you're just another target. Out there, I'm someone fighting beside the person I love. That's worth more than hiding and hoping." They stared at each other across the space of that decision. Finally, Lucian nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acceptance that arguing would waste time they didn't have. "Stay behind me. Don't engage unless you have to. And if things go wrong, they won't. If they do, you run. Promise me." Evelyn kissed him instead of promising because they both knew she wouldn't run. Couldn't, even if survival depended on it. They'd come too far together to separate now. Lucien checked his weapons, a pistol he'd retrieved from the study, a knife strapped to his belt. Not much against a dozen armed men, but enough to make a stand. He handed Evelyn a second pistol. "You know how to use this? Point and pull the trigger. I'm familiar with the concept. Try not to shoot me. I'll do my best." They moved to the main entrance. The sounds of fighting echoed through the manor, shouts and gunfire and the crash of furniture being overturned. Lucien's guards were dying to buy time that might not matter. The doors swung open. Lucien stepped out onto the front steps with Evelyn slightly behind him, and the fighting stopped as if someone had cut all sound from the world. Harrington stood at the bottom of the steps, flanked by the remains of his hired force. 8 men still standing, weapons drawn, looking at the Duke who'd just walked into their sights. Well, Harrington said softly, this is unexpected. I thought I'd have to burn you out. You want me. Here I am. Call off your men, and we'll settle this the way it should have been settled 5 years ago. Just you and me, just us. One way or another, this ends tonight. Harrington studied him with the calculating expression of a man trying to identify the trap. You're not this stupid, Lucien. What's the play? No play. I'm tired of people dying because you can't accept that you lost. You wanted the estate, the title, the power. None of that matters anymore. So take your shot or walk away, but stop destroying everyone around me to get to me. And if I win, then you get what you wanted. The estate, the influence, all of it. Evelyn walks away unharmed and you leave her alone. That's the deal. What's to stop me from just killing you both right now? Honor. Assuming you have any left. Harrington laughed, but it sounded hollow. Honor. Your father beat that concept out of me decades ago. But fine. I'll play your game, he gestured. His men lowered their weapons slightly, creating space between Harrington and Lucien. How do you want to do this? Pistols, blades, bare hands? The way my father taught us both. The statement carried weight beyond the literal. This wasn't just about survival. This was about confronting the legacy of violence that had shaped them both, about determining whether that legacy would continue or end tonight. Harrington removed his coat, rolled his shoulders. When he moved into the cleared space at the bottom of the steps, Evelyn saw he was still powerful despite his age, broader than Lucien, heavier, with the kind of strength that came from years of maintaining physical dominance. But Lucien had something Harrington didn't. He'd spent his entire life surviving violence, learning to endure pain, developing the kind of desperate resilience that came from knowing hesitation meant death. They circled each other like wolves testing for weakness. Harrington struck first, a heavy blow aimed at Lucien's head that would have ended the fight if it landed. Lucien ducked under it, countered with a strike to Harrington's ribs that connected with satisfying force. The older man grunted, stepped back. You've gotten better. I've had practice. They clashed again. This time Harrington was ready, catching Lucien's arm and using superior weight to drive him backward. They went down together, rolling across gravel, each trying to gain position while landing blows wherever opening appeared. Evelyn watched with her heart hammering, the pistol heavy in her hand. She'd promised to stay back, to not interfere, but watching Lucien take hit after hit from a man who'd murdered his father and tried to destroy his life was agony. Harrington got on top, his hands closing around Lucien's throat, his face twisted into something ugly. You should have died with your father. Should have been weak enough that I could have justified ending you then. Instead, you survived and forced me to get creative. Lucien's face was going red, his hands clawing at Harrington's grip. Evelyn raised the pistol. One of Harrington's men moved to intercept her. She fired without thinking. The shot went wide, but close enough that the man dove for cover. The distraction was enough. Lucien got his knee up, drove it into Harrington's stomach hard enough to break the chokehold, rolled, reversed their positions, and started raining down blows with the systematic brutality of someone who'd learned violence as a survival skill. Each hit carried years of rage, years of betrayal, years of being told he was broken and worthless and damaged beyond repair. Harrington's face became a mask of blood and bruising, and still Lucien didn't stop. Enough, Pemberton called from the manor entrance. Your Grace, you've won. Stop before you kill him. But Lucien was beyond hearing. He was locked in the space where trauma lived, where the only response to threat was overwhelming violence, where stopping meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant death. Evelyn moved without thinking, dropped the pistol, approached the two men locked in their death spiral. Lucien, she said quietly, it's over. You won. His fist froze mid-swing. She saw him fight to resurface from wherever the rage had taken him. He's done. He can't hurt you anymore. You can stop. Lucien looked down at Harrington, bloodied, semi-conscious, no longer the threat he'd been moments before. Looked at his own hands, split knuckles bleeding. Looked at Evelyn standing in the space between him and complete destruction. Slowly he stood. Stepped back. Let Pemberton's guards move in to secure Harrington. The fight drained out of him all at once. He swayed and Evelyn caught him, held him upright while he remembered how to breathe like a person instead of an animal defending territory. I almost killed him, Lucien said hoarsely. I know. I wanted to. Wanted to beat him to death the way my father would have. But you didn't. You stopped. That's what matters, because you were there. His arms came around her, holding tight. If you hadn't been there, I would have become exactly what he accused me of being. The guards were rounding up Harrington's men, those still alive and capable of surrender. Pemberton supervised with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with this kind of aftermath before. The manor's doors opened and the Duke's own guards emerged, battered but alive. The siege was over. The conspiracy ended. The man who'd orchestrated years of manipulation and murder was in custody. They'd won. But standing in the wreckage of that victory, holding Lucien while he shook with adrenaline crash and recognition of how close he'd come to losing himself entirely, Evelyn understood that winning and surviving weren't always the same thing. What? The king's reinforcements arrived 2 hours later to find the situation already resolved. They took custody of Harrington and his surviving men, documented the carnage, and prepared the official reports that would justify the violence to those who demanded accountability. Lucien gave his statement with mechanical precision, just the facts, stripped of emotion or context. Evelyn watched him rebuild the walls, pull the mask back into place, become the Duke who'd learned to function despite carrying damage that would have destroyed lesser men. By dawn, they were alone again in the manor that had transformed from prison to fortress to battlefield and back to home. The staff began filtering back, cleaning blood from marble floors and boarding broken windows. Graves supervised with his usual unflappable efficiency, as if noble houses under siege was simply another task requiring proper management. Evelyn found Lucien in his study, standing at the window watching sunrise paint the grounds in shades of gold and amber. He'd cleaned the blood from his hands, but bruises were already forming across his knuckles, his jaw, his ribs, where Harrington's blows had landed. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I should feel victorious, but mostly just feel tired." She moved to stand beside him. "We survived. That counts for something. Did we? Or did we just delay the inevitable? There will be other conspiracies, other people who think I'm weak enough to exploit. This doesn't end. Maybe not completely. But you proved something tonight. To yourself, if no one else." "What's that?" "That you can face the worst parts of your trauma and come out the other side still yourself. Still someone who chooses mercy when violence would be easier. I almost beat him to death." "Almost isn't the same as did. You stopped. That distinction matters." Lucien turned to face her fully. His expression was raw in the morning light, all defenses down, all pretense stripped away. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "How to be someone who survives without becoming the monster my father created. How to wield power without letting it consume everything good. How to love you without destroying you with the same damage that makes me dangerous." "Then we figure it out together. Make mistakes, learn from them, build something that survives our worst impulses because we're both committed to not letting the damage win. What if the damage is stronger? Then we fight it. Every day. As many times as it takes." She took his damaged hands in hers, careful of the split knuckles. "You're not your father, you're not Harrington, you're someone who survived hell and chose kindness anyway. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever witnessed. It doesn't feel strong. Most real strength doesn't. It feels like barely holding on, like making the harder choice when the easy one is right there, like choosing vulnerability when every instinct screams to protect yourself." His forehead came to rest against hers. "I love you, and I'm terrified of what that means. It means we build a life together despite the fear, despite the damage, despite every logical reason this shouldn't work. That's not a plan. That's faith. Maybe faith is all we've got." They stood there as the sun climbed higher, warming the study that had witnessed so many battles against external enemies and internal demons. The manor settled around them, damaged but standing, and Evelyn felt the weight of everything they'd survived begin to transform into something else. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But possibility. The possibility that survival could evolve into something resembling peace if they fought for it with the same ferocity they'd fought for everything else. The weeks that followed felt like learning to walk after years of running. The king formally exonerated Lucien of all charges and dissolved the oversight committee. The victory at the manor had proven competence more effectively than any quarterly review. The conspiracy trials proceeded with ruthless efficiency, and one by one, the men who thought they could manipulate a damaged duke faced execution or imprisonment. Harrington died on the scaffold 3 weeks after the siege, unrepentant to the end. Lucien didn't attend the execution. Eveline found him in the library that morning, reading the same page over and over without processing the words. "You didn't have to stay away," she said gently. "Yes, I did. Watching him die would have felt like victory, and I don't trust what I'd become if I started celebrating death. Even the death of someone who tried to murder you, especially that. Because enjoying it would mean accepting that violence is the answer, and I've spent too long learning it's not." She sat beside him, took the book from his hands. "What is the answer, then?" "I don't know. Surviving, maybe. Choosing something better when you have the option. Not letting the people who damaged you define who you become. That's not much of an answer. It's the only one I've got." The estate slowly healed around them. Broken windows repaired, blood stains scrubbed from stone. The physical damage of the siege erased until only memory remained. But the deeper healing took longer, the kind that happened in midnight conversations when nightmares still came, but felt less overwhelming with someone there to anchor you to reality. Lucian's nightmares didn't disappear, but they changed. Instead of just his father's voice and Harrington's betrayal, they started including moments of survival. Eveline's presence, the choice to stop before becoming the monster. Small victories woven into the trauma until the darkness felt less absolute. 6 months after the siege, the king summoned them to court for a formal recognition ceremony. Lucien had argued against it. Public spectacle felt like the opposite of the quiet rebuilding they'd been doing, but refusing would have been political suicide. So they went, dressed in finery that cost obscene amounts, walked into a throne room packed with nobles who'd witnessed their struggles and either supported or opposed them depending on which way power flowed. The king stood as they approached the dais. His expression was unreadable. "Duke Blackthorn, Duchess, you have served this kingdom well through circumstances that would have destroyed lesser individuals. Your exposure of conspiracy within my own council, your defense of your holdings against hostile forces, and your commitment to justice despite personal cost have earned my deepest respect." He gestured. A servant brought forward a velvet case. "Therefore it is my honor to award you both the Order of the Crown for exceptional service to the realm. May your loyalty and courage serve as example to all who witness it." The medal was heavy when the king placed it around Lucian's neck. Symbolic weight of recognition and expectation. Eveline received hers with the understanding that this wasn't just ceremony. This was the king publicly declaring the Blackthorns untouchable, a warning to anyone who might consider future conspiracy. The applause that followed felt genuine for the first time since they'd entered court society. Not the polite recognition of duty, but actual appreciation from people who'd watched them survive the unsurvivable. Afterwards, at the reception, Lord Pemberton approached with something that might have been a smile. "Congratulations, Your Grace. You've achieved what most spend lifetimes pursuing, genuine respect from people who have no reason to give it." "I'd have preferred a quiet life," Lucian said. "Would you really? Because it seems to me you've built exactly the life you needed. Not the one you wanted, perhaps, but the one that forced you to become someone stronger than your damage. That sounds like philosophy. Call it observation. You were handed trauma and betrayal and every excuse to become a monster. Instead, you became someone capable of mercy and love and strategic brilliance. That's not accident. That's choice." Pemberton moved on to other conversations. Lucian looked at Eveline. "Do you think he's right? That this is the life I needed? I think you survived the life you were given and made something better from the pieces. Whether you needed it or just endured it probably doesn't matter in the end. What matters? That you're here, that we both are, that everything that tried to destroy us failed." Lucian pulled her close, ignoring the watching nobles and their endless capacity for gossip. His hand settled at the small of her back. "I used to think survival was enough, just making it through each day without breaking. Now I'm starting to believe maybe there's something beyond that. Like what? Like actually living, building something that matters, loving someone without terror of inevitable destruction. That's ambitious. You think I can't manage it? I think you're already managing it. You just haven't recognized it yet." The orchestra began playing. Couples moved onto the dance floor in swirls of silk and calculated social positioning. Lucien offered his hand. They danced the way they'd learned to do everything together, imperfectly, with occasional missteps, but with the coordination of two people who'd fought enough battles to trust each other's instincts. "What happens now?" Eveline asked as they turned. "Now we go home. Run the estate. Attend tedious functions. Live the boring aristocratic life everyone expects." That actually sounds boring, Good. I'm ready for boring. Liar. He smiled, genuine and warm and so different from the cold mask he'd worn when they first met that Eveline felt her heart clench. Fine. I'm ready for boring, interrupted by occasional excitement. Strategic planning, political maneuvering, the kind of danger that doesn't involve people trying to murder us. Much better. The song ended. They stood in the center of the dance floor, and Lucien looked at her with something that might have been wonder. I never thought I'd have this, he said quietly. Someone who chose me, who stayed when leaving would have been smarter, who loved me despite every reason not to. I never thought I'd find someone worth fighting for. Evelyn touched his face. Turns out we were both wrong about what we deserved. They returned to Blackthorn Manor as spring transformed the grounds from winter barren to something approaching alive. Evelyn watched the changes with fascination, the way green crept back into dead branches, the way flowers emerged from soil that had seemed permanently frozen. It felt metaphorical in the way everything did when you'd survived trauma. The land healing, the manor warming, the walls that had felt like prison becoming something closer to home. One morning, she found Lucien in the garden folly they'd discovered during her first exploration of the grounds. He was reading correspondence, his expression focused but not tense. When he noticed her approach, he smiled. Morning, love. The casualness of it still caught her off guard sometimes. The transformation from the cold duke who dismissed her like furniture to this man who smiled when she appeared. What are you reading? Proposals for estate improvements. Apparently now that we're not fighting for survival, there's actual work to do. How terrible. Devastating. He set down the papers. Come here. She settled beside him on the stone bench. His arm came around her shoulders automatically, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. I've been thinking, he said. About? The future. What we want to build now that we're not just surviving. And what do you want? Lucien was quiet for a moment, considering. I want to make this estate into something that helps people instead of just existing as monument to old power. I want to use the influence I've got to change the systems that create people like my father. I want to wake up next to you for the next 50 years and never take for granted that I get to. That's a good list. What about you? What do you want? Evelyn leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his solid presence, the quiet strength that came from surviving hell and learning to choose kindness anyway. I want to watch you become the person you're meant to be without the weight of everyone else's expectations. I want to build something that matters with you. I want our children, if we have them, to grow up in a house that feels like home instead of fortress. Children. Lucien's voice went soft. You've thought about that. Sometimes. When I'm not terrified of passing damage to the next generation. We'll figure it out the same way we've figured out everything else. Imperfectly, with mistakes, but together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the grounds wake up to spring. Somewhere in the distance, Evelyn heard Graves directing staff through some project, heard birdsong returning after winter silence, heard life continuing in all its messy complexity. Do you ever regret it? Lucien asked suddenly. The arranged marriage, being forced into this life. Every day, Evelyn said. Then she smiled at his expression. I regret the circumstances, the lack of choice, the way my family treated me like property to be traded. But I don't regret where it led. I don't regret you. Even when I'm difficult, especially then, anyone can love someone easy. Loving someone complicated takes actual commitment. That's either very wise or completely insane. Both. Definitely both. He kissed her temple. I love you, in case I haven't mentioned it today. You mentioned it 3 times. Once when you woke up, once at breakfast, once before you came out here. Felt worth repeating. Evelyn turned in his arms, looking at him properly. Really looking, at the face she'd learned to read, the eyes that no longer held quite so much pain, the mouth that smiled more easily than it had months ago. This was what they'd built from the wreckage of an arranged marriage and a conspiracy that nearly destroyed them. Not perfection, not the fantasy of effortless love, but something real and hard-won and worth every battle they'd fought to get here. The nightmares would probably never fully disappear. The damage from Lucien's childhood would always be there, carved into his bones the way scars marked his skin. But they'd learned to live around it, to build something strong enough to survive the worst days and celebrate the good ones. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Scout. The anniversary of their wedding arrived on a night that felt designed for significance. Clear sky, full moon, the manor lit from within like a beacon against darkness. They'd planned nothing elaborate, just a quiet dinner and the acknowledgement that they'd survived a full year of marriage that neither had wanted and both had learned to fight for. Lucien met her at the base of the grand staircase, dressed in formal black that made him look like elegant death. His expression when he saw her descending the stairs was worth every moment of preparation. Wonder and desire and something deeper that didn't have name. "You're stunning," he said. "You're biased." "Absolutely." Doesn't make it less true. He offered his arm. They walked to the dining room together, but instead of the formal table, he'd arranged something different. The room had been transformed, candles everywhere, a small table positioned by the windows overlooking the grounds, 2 place settings, and an intimacy that felt deliberate. "You did this?" Evelyn asked, with significant help from Graves and Annie, and basically the entire staff. "But yes, the idea was mine." They sat. Dinner was excellent, the kind of meal that took hours to prepare and was meant to be savored slowly. They talked through courses about everything and nothing, comfortable in the way only people who'd fought their way to understanding could be. After dessert, Lucien stood and offered his hand. "Walk with me?" They moved through the manor together, and Evelyn realized he was guiding her toward the west wing, toward his rooms that had once been forbidden territory and had gradually transformed into their shared space. The door stood open. Inside, the room had changed, less austere, more lived in, marked by the presence of 2 people instead of 1 man isolated by choice and fear. 1 year ago, Lucien said quietly, "You walked through those gates expecting a nightmare. I gave you exactly that. Cold distance, locked doors, a husband who treated you like unwanted furniture. You were protecting yourself. I was being a coward." He turned to face her fully. "I was so convinced that loving anyone would destroy both of us that I tried to prevent it through sheer force of will. And then you refused to give up, refused to let me hide, kept showing up in the darkness even when I gave you every reason to run." His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "You saved me, Eveline, not from Harrington or conspiracies or external threats, from myself, from the belief that I was too damaged to deserve good things, from the conviction that survival was the best I could hope for. You saved yourself. I just stayed long enough to witness it. We saved each other then." He smiled. "How's that for compromise?" "I can live with that." He kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, he pulled something from his pocket. A ring, simple gold band with a single stone that caught moonlight streaming through the window. "I know we're already married, that this is technically redundant, but I wanted to give you a choice this time." He went down on one knee, and Evelyn's breath caught. Evelyn Harper Blackthorne. "Will you marry me? Not because families negotiated or circumstances forced you, but because you choose this. Choose us. Choose the life we've built from the disaster we were handed." Tears blurred her vision. She nodded because words felt inadequate for what she was feeling. The weight of being chosen, of choosing in return, of transforming obligation into something that mattered. "Yes," she managed finally. "Yes, of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger beside the one she'd worn for a year. It fit perfectly, like he'd measured while she slept or paid attention to details most people wouldn't notice. They stood together, and Evelyn felt the significance of the moment settle over them. This wasn't the scared girl walking into a nightmare, or the damaged duke hiding from the world. This was 2 people who'd survived everything designed to destroy them and decided to build something better from the pieces. "Thank you," Lucien said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up. For staying when leaving would have been easier. For loving me when I was convinced I was unlovable. Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me with your damage, for becoming someone capable of this." She gestured at the room, the ring, the vulnerability of the gesture he'd just made. "We're going to fight," he said. "We're going to struggle. The damage doesn't magically disappear because we love each other. I know, but we'll face it together. We'll choose each other even when it's hard. We'll build the kind of marriage that survives worst impulses and celebrates the good days. That's the best promise I've ever heard." They made love that night with the tenderness of people who'd earned intimacy through battle and the passion of 2 people finally allowing themselves to believe in happiness. Afterwards, lying tangled together in darkness, Evelyn listened to Lucian's heartbeat and felt peace settle over her like a benediction. This was what they'd built. This was what they'd become. Not despite the damage, but incorporating it, learning to love around the scars, to find strength in vulnerability, to choose each other when easier options existed. The manor settled into night around them. Outside, the ground stretched toward darkness, and somewhere in that darkness the future waited, uncertain, potentially dangerous, but faced together. Evelyn had learned that together made all the difference. That love wasn't about finding someone undamaged, but about choosing someone despite the damage and fighting for them when fighting was required. She'd found that in Lucien, in this fierce, broken, brilliant man who'd learned to survive hell and had chosen to build heaven from the ashes. That was enough. That was everything. And as sleep claimed them both, peaceful for once, without nightmares or fear, Evelyn understood that sometimes the greatest love stories weren't about perfection. They were about two imperfect people choosing each other anyway, about building light in darkness, about surviving together when survival alone would have been easier, about learning that the strongest fortresses weren't made of stone and distance. They were built from trust and choosing to stay in love fierce enough to weather any storm. That was the legacy they'd create from the disaster they'd been handed. That was the truth worth holding on to when everything else burned. And in the quiet of Blackthorn Manor, no longer prison, no longer battlefield, but finally home, two people who'd survived the unsurvivable slept peacefully in each other's arms. The darkness would always be there. The damage would always exist. But so would they. Together. And that made all the difference. P.